Not every question has an answer. Some are meant to echo. There are thoughts that arrive uninvited in the quiet spaces of your mind while you're washing dishes, walking through empty streets, lying awake in the hour before dawn. They don't announce themselves as philosophy or demand immediate resolution. They simply appear like unexpected visitors, carrying questions that seem to have been waiting patiently for your attention. What if nothing you see is real? What if your memories are fabrications? What if the colours you experience exist nowhere but in the private theatre of your consciousness? What if other people are as unknowable to you as distant stars, their inner lives forever hidden behind the performance of behaviour and expression? These aren't the kind of questions that textbooks were designed to answer. They're thought experiments, mental laboratories, where philosophers have been conducting tests on reality for thousands of years, not to solve the mysteries of existence, but to illuminate their beautiful, unsettling depths. Tonight, you'll encounter 100 of these experiments, each one a small disturbance in the comfortable certainty of everyday experience. They won't teach you facts or provide solutions. They'll do something stranger and perhaps more valuable. They'll show you the edges of what can be known, the places where logic meets mystery, where reason encounters its own limits and discovers something like wonder. You don't need to memorize them or solve them. You don't need to choose sides or reach conclusions. Just listen. Let them disturb the surface of your mind, then sink. Some may dissolve immediately, leaving only the faintest trace of having been there. Others may return to you days from now, uninvited, in the middle of ordinary moments when your defenses are down and your attention is elsewhere. The experiments you're about to encounter have been disturbing the peace of human thinking for centuries. They emerge from brilliant minds wrestling with questions that wouldn't leave them alone. Descartes, by his fire, wondering what he could know with absolute certainty. Berkeley walking through London, questioning whether the world existed when no one was looking. Putnam in his study, imagining brains sustained in laboratory vats, dreaming lives they'd never lived. These weren't abstract exercises. They were desperate attempts to understand what it means to be conscious, to perceive, to know anything at all about the reality we seem to inhabit but can never quite grasp directly. Each experiment represents a moment when someone looked at the ordinary world and saw something extraordinary, not because reality had changed, but because their way of seeing had shifted just enough to reveal the strangeness that was always there. The territory we'll explore together stretches from the most intimate questions about your personal identity to the vastest puzzles about infinity and existence. We'll visit the boundaries between self and world, consciousness and matter, choice and determinism, meaning and meaninglessness. We'll discover how quickly solid ground can become quicksand when you examine it closely enough. But we'll move slowly through this landscape like travellers who have nowhere urgent to be, who can afford to pause when something catches their attention, who understand that the journey matters more than any destination. The experiments will unfold at the pace of reflection rather than instruction, of contemplation rather than argument, and perhaps, in the spaces between questions, in the silence that follows each experiment, you'll discover something unexpected. Not answers, but a different relationship with not knowing. A comfort with mystery that transforms uncertainty from burden into invitation. The first territory we'll explore together questions the most fundamental assumption of conscious experience, that your senses provide reliable information about a world that exists independently of your perception. These experiments suggest that everything you take for granted about reality might rest on foundations far less solid than you imagine. In 1641, René Descartes sat by his fire on a winter evening, embarking on what he called a systematic program of doubt. He had decided to question everything, absolutely everything, that he had previously accepted as true, to see if anything remained that could not possibly be false. The exercise wasn't born from idle curiosity, but from a deep crisis of confidence in human knowledge, a recognition that much of what people believed turned out to be mistaken. As Descartes stared into the flames, he began to doubt his senses. The warmth he felt, the light he saw, the crackling sounds he heard. What if none of it was real? What if some evil demon of extraordinary power had deceived him about everything, creating the illusion of a physical world while he existed in some other realm entirely? His mind fed false sensations that seemed perfectly real. The demon wasn't a theological concern for Descartes, but a philosophical instrument, a way of pushing doubt to its absolute limit. If such a being could create the perfect illusion of reality, then how could you ever know whether your experience corresponded to anything real? The heat from the fire might be a fabrication. The fire itself might be a lie. The room, the house, the world beyond, all of it might exist only in the artificial experiences generated by this deceiving intelligence. The evil demon represents more than historical curiosity. It captures something that feels urgent in an age of virtual reality, deepfake videos, and social media algorithms that create personalized versions of reality for each user. The question Descartes posed by his fire has become a daily concern. How do you distinguish between authentic experience and sophisticated illusion when the illusions keep getting more sophisticated? But the demon does something else too. It reveals how little you actually know about the mechanics of your own experience. You can't explain how colours arise in consciousness, how sounds emerge from air pressure changes, how the firing of neurons becomes the felt experience of warmth or pain or satisfaction. The gap between physical processes and conscious experience remains as mysterious now as it was to Descartes. In that gap, the demon still whispers its questions. 3 centuries later, Hilary Putnam updated Descartes' demon for the age of computers and neuroscience. Imagine, Putnam suggested, that you're a brain in a vat, kept alive by nutrients and electrical stimulation, with every experience of having a body, living in a world relating to other people generated by a supercomputer connected to your neural tissue. The vat scenario feels more plausible than Descartes' demon, because it relies on technology rather than supernatural powers, because it builds on actual knowledge about how brains function and how computers can simulate complex environments. Scientists can already stimulate brain regions to produce specific experiences. They can create virtual realities that feel convincingly real. The gap between current technology and Putnam's scenario seems like a matter of degree rather than impossibility. But Putnam's brain poses the same fundamental challenge as Descartes' demon. If your experiences could be generated by something other than the world they seem to represent, how could you ever know which situation you're actually in? The brain in the vat would have exactly the same experiences as a brain in a body. Its memories of childhood, relationships, achievements, and losses would feel equally real, equally meaningful, equally true. The computer generating its experiences might be so sophisticated that it includes memories of reading about brain in vat scenarios, of discussing them with friends, of feeling clever for understanding the philosophical problem. The simulated brain might even believe it has conclusively proven that it's not in a vat, while the actual situation is precisely the opposite. This isn't just a problem for hypothetical brains, it's a problem for you, right now, as you listen to these words. Every experience you've ever had, every sensation, memory, emotion, thought, could theoretically be generated by a sufficiently advanced simulation. The fact that this possibility seems absurd or unlikely doesn't eliminate it. Your sense that it's absurd could itself be part of the simulation. In our current moment, the brain in vat scenario has evolved into the simulation hypothesis, popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom and embraced by technologists who take it seriously as a prediction about the future. If civilizations eventually develop the computational power to run detailed simulations of conscious beings, Bostrom argues, they would likely run many such simulations. The simulated beings would outnumber the non-simulated beings by vast margins. If that's true, then most conscious beings who ever exist will be simulations rather than biological entities. And if most conscious beings are simulations, then the chances that you happen to be one of the rare non-simulated beings become vanishingly small. You're probably in a simulation right now, Bostrom suggests, simply because simulated beings are more numerous than non-simulated beings. The simulation hypothesis carries implications that the evil demon and brain in vat scenarios don't quite capture. It suggests that your entire reality might be a kind of entertainment, research project, or historical recreation being run by beings whose existence is as remote from yours as yours is from the characters in video games. Your struggles, relationships, achievements, and sufferings might be data points in someone else's experiment. But the simulation hypothesis also offers a strange kind of comfort. If you're in a simulation sophisticated enough to include the experience of reading about simulation hypotheses, then the beings running the simulation have created something remarkable. A reality complete enough to support genuine relationships, real learning, authentic growth and suffering and joy. The simulation would be real in every way that matters for lived experience, even if it's not real in the way you assumed. Perhaps the most disturbing challenge to the reliability of perception comes from considering how arbitrary your particular way of experiencing might be. When you look at a ripe strawberry, you experience something you call red. But what if the colour experience you call red corresponds to what other people would call green if they could access your consciousness directly? This inverted spectrum scenario suggests that two people could have systematically different colour experiences while having identical behaviour and identical neural responses to coloured objects. You point to strawberries and say red. So do they. You both stop at red traffic lights, seek out red roses, describe blood as red. But the internal experience you have when looking at strawberries might be indistinguishable from the internal experience they have when looking at grass. The inversion could be partial rather than complete. Perhaps what you experience as purple corresponds to what they experience as orange, while your red matches their green and your blue matches their yellow. The differences would be undetectable from the outside because your behavioural responses would remain perfectly coordinated. You would both call strawberries red, but you would mean completely different experiences by the word. This isn't just a puzzle about colour. It applies to every aspect of conscious experience that has a qualitative, subjective dimension. The taste you experience when eating chocolate, the feeling you have when listening to music, the sensation of warmth from sunlight. All of these could vary dramatically between people while remaining behaviourally and neurologically identical. The inverted spectrum reveals something profound about the privacy of consciousness. Your inner experience remains forever locked inside your particular nervous system, inaccessible to direct observation by anyone else. You can describe what you experience, but descriptions rely on shared language that might refer to completely different internal realities. Mary the colour scientist, imagined by philosopher Frank Jackson, spent her entire life in a black and white environment while becoming the world's leading expert on the physics and psychology of colour. Mary's room contained only black, white and grey objects. She observed the world through black and white monitors. She wore black and white clothes and ate colourless food. Despite these limitations, Mary learned everything there was to know about colour from a physical perspective. She understood exactly which wavelengths of light correspond to different colour names. She knew how various colours are processed by the human visual system. She could predict precisely how people would respond to different colour combinations. Her knowledge of colour science was complete and perfect. But then Mary left her room and saw a red apple for the first time. Jackson argued that Mary would learn something new in that moment. Not a new fact about physics or psychology, but something about what the experience of redness actually feels like. The redness itself, as a conscious experience, was missing from all her previous knowledge. Mary's room suggests that conscious experience contains something irreducible to physical description, something that can only be known through direct acquaintance. No amount of objective knowledge about brain states, wavelengths and behavioural responses can capture what it's like to experience red, or pain, or the taste of coffee, or the feeling of embarrassment. This creates what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, not explaining what the brain does, but explaining why the brain's activities feel like anything at all. Why isn't the processing of visual information by your nervous system just information processing? Why does it feel like seeing? Why does the detection of tissue damage feel like pain, rather than simply triggering appropriate behavioural responses? Mary's room implies that consciousness includes something beyond the reach of scientific description, something that can only be known from the inside. But it also suggests that this inner dimension of experience might be the most important aspect of what makes life meaningful. The redness that Mary discovers isn't just an interesting philosophical puzzle. It's the difference between knowing about beauty and experiencing it. The problem of other minds extends Mary's isolation to everyone you've ever encountered. You can observe other people's behaviour, listen to their words, watch their facial expressions, and measure their brain activity. But you can never directly access their consciousness. You can never know what it feels like to be them, to experience the world from their perspective, to have their particular inner life. This creates an enormous assumption underlying all social interaction, that other people have inner experiences at all. When your friend says she's in pain, you assume she's having an experience similar to what you call pain. When your colleague laughs at a joke, you assume he's having an experience similar to what you call amusement. But these assumptions could be completely wrong. Other people might be what philosophers call zombies, beings who behave exactly like conscious entities while having no inner experience whatsoever. A philosophical zombie would respond to pain stimuli by saying ouch and withdrawing from the source of damage, but would feel nothing. It would laugh at jokes but experience no amusement. It would claim to see colours but have no visual experiences. The zombie scenario seems absurd because consciousness feels so fundamental to your own existence that imagining beings who lack it entirely while still behaving normally feels impossible. But the impossibility might reflect your limited perspective rather than actual impossibility. You can't imagine what it would be like to be a zombie, because being a zombie wouldn't be like anything. There would be no inner experience to imagine. The Chinese room proposed by philosopher John Searle suggests that even sophisticated information processing doesn't necessarily generate consciousness or understanding. Imagine a person who speaks only English, locked in a room with an enormous rule book written in English. The room receives pieces of paper with Chinese characters written on them. The person uses the rule book to write appropriate Chinese characters on other pieces of paper and sends them out. From the outside, the room appears to understand Chinese perfectly. Questions written in Chinese receive appropriate answers written in Chinese. Conversations flow naturally. The responses demonstrate knowledge, humour, empathy, and intelligence. But the person inside the room understands nothing about Chinese and has no idea what the conversations are about. The Chinese room suggests that consciousness and understanding might require more than just processing information correctly. A computer program might behave exactly like a conscious being while having no inner experience, no genuine understanding, no awareness of what it's doing or why. The processing might be perfectly functional without being experiential. But the Chinese room also raises questions about your own understanding. How do you know that your own consciousness involves more than sophisticated information processing? How do you know that your feeling of understanding is anything more than the subjective experience of running very complex programs? Perhaps the difference between conscious understanding and mechanical processing is less clear than it initially appears. Qualia, the felt qualities of conscious experience, remain as mysterious now as they were when philosophers first tried to understand them. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of chocolate, the sound of music. These qualitative aspects of experience seem to resist scientific explanation, not because science isn't advanced enough, but because they might be fundamentally different from the kinds of things science can describe. When you see blue, something happens in your visual cortex that's measurable and describable. But the blueness itself, the particular way blue looks to you, seems to be something additional, something over and above the neural activity. The neural activity is objective, publicly observable, and scientifically tractable. The blueness is subjective, privately experienced, and apparently beyond the reach of third-person description. This creates what some philosophers call the explanatory gap between physical processes and conscious experience. You can explain what the brain does when you see blue, which cells fire, how information gets processed, what behavioural responses get prepared. But explaining why doing these things feels like anything at all, why they generate the particular experience of blueness, remains mysterious. The gap might be unbridgeable not because consciousness is supernatural, but because consciousness represents a fundamentally different category of phenomenon, something that can only be understood from the perspective of a being who experiences it, rather than from the perspective of an outside observer trying to explain it. Philosopher Donald Davidson imagined a being called Swampman that spontaneously emerges from a swamp when lightning strikes a fallen log in exactly the right way to create a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of Davidson himself. Swampman has all of Davidson's memories, speaks all the same words, recognizes all the same people, and behaves in all the same ways. But Swampman has never actually experienced any of the events he seems to remember. The question Swampman raises is whether consciousness requires historical continuity, or whether it can emerge instantly in any sufficiently complex system. Is consciousness something that develops over time through interaction with the world, or is it something that exists fully formed whenever the right physical conditions are present? If consciousness requires history, then Swampman lacks genuine experience despite behaving exactly like Davidson. If consciousness doesn't require history, then Swampman is as conscious as anyone else from the moment he emerges from the swamp. The answer reveals fundamental assumptions about what consciousness is and how it relates to memory, identity, and physical structure. The perception and reality experiments work together to create a kind of vertigo, not the physical disorientation that comes from spinning around, but the intellectual disorientation that comes from recognizing how little you actually know about the most basic features of your existence. They suggest that the common sense view of perception as a reliable source of information about an external world might be a useful fiction rather than literal truth. But they also reveal something beautiful about the situation you find yourself in. Whether you're a brain in a vat, a character in a simulation, or a biological being experiencing an external world through evolution-shaped senses, you're having experiences that feel meaningful, relationships that matter, thoughts and sensations that constitute the texture of a life worth living. The experiments don't solve the puzzle of consciousness or provide definitive answers about the nature of reality. They do something more valuable. They show you the edges of what can be known, the boundaries beyond which certainty gives way to mystery. In that recognition, there's perhaps room for both humility about human knowledge and wonder at the sheer improbability of being conscious at all. You're having experiences right now, the sound of these words, the feeling of your attention moving from thought to thought, the background awareness of being someone listening to ideas about consciousness and reality. Whatever else might be true about the ultimate nature of these experiences, they are undeniably present, undeniably yours, undeniably remarkable. The experiments that question everything leave that marvel untouched. They might show that you can't know what reality is, but they confirm that reality includes the extraordinary fact of your being aware enough to wonder about it at all. What are you across time? Who were you yesterday? Are you still that person now? The questions arrive quietly, without fanfare, in moments when you catch sight of yourself in an unexpected mirror or stumble across a photograph from years past. The face looking back feels familiar and foreign simultaneously, recognizably yours, yet somehow belonging to a stranger whose thoughts you can only guess at, whose concerns feel distant and half-remembered. You carry within you the accumulated layers of every version of yourself you've ever been. The child who was afraid of the dark still lives somewhere in your nervous system. The teenager who felt everything with devastating intensity remains embedded in your emotional responses. The young adult who made choices you now question continues to influence the trajectory of your life. Yet the person you are today feels fundamentally different from all of them, connected by an invisible thread of continuity that you can sense but never quite examine directly. Time moves through you like water through a riverbed, shaping and reshaping the landscape of identity, while preserving something essential that feels permanent even as everything changes. But when you try to grasp what that permanent thing might be, it slips away like water through your fingers, leaving you with the curious puzzle of what it means to persist as yourself across the constant flux of time and change. The ancient Greeks told the story of a ship that belonged to the hero Theseus, preserved in Athens as a monument to his victories. Over the years, as individual planks rotted, they were replaced with new wood of the same type. Eventually, every single piece of the original ship had been replaced. The Athenians continued to call it the Ship of Theseus, but philosophers began to wonder, was it still the same ship? The question seems simple enough until you begin to consider the implications. If replacing one plank doesn't change the ship's identity, why should replacing all the planks change it? But if the ship remains the same despite total replacement of its parts, then what makes it the same ship? The wood is different, the nails are different. Every physical component that existed when Theseus first sailed has been discarded and replaced. Perhaps identity lies not in the materials but in the pattern, the arrangement, the functional organisation that makes a collection of planks into a ship, capable of carrying people across water. But patterns change too. The replacement planks might be arranged slightly differently. The new wood might have different grain, different weight, different response to weather and stress. The ship of Theseus becomes more puzzling when you imagine that someone collected all the discarded original planks and reassembled them into a ship using the original design. Now you have two ships, one that maintained continuity of location and function while gradually replacing all its parts, and one that maintained continuity of materials while losing continuity of existence. Which one deserves to be called the ship of Theseus? Your body faces the same puzzle as Theseus's ship. Every cell in your body is replaced over time, some quickly, some slowly, but eventually all of them. The atoms that make up your brain today are not the atoms that made up your brain 7 years ago. The molecules that constitute your heart, your skin, your bones, have all been recycled through the ongoing process of metabolism and cellular renewal. Yet you feel like the same person you were 7 years ago, despite inhabiting what is essentially a different physical body. Your sense of identity persists through complete material transformation. You're a pattern that maintains itself while constantly changing its substrate, a river that remains recognisably itself while never containing the same water twice. But the mystery deepens when you consider what might be preserved across these changes. Your memories provide one candidate for continuity, but memories change too. You remember events differently now than you did when they happened. Details fade, merge with other experiences, get influenced by later knowledge and changing perspectives. The story you tell yourself about your past evolves constantly, shaped by who you are now as much as by what actually happened then. Your personality offers another possibility for continuity, but personality changes as well. You respond differently to stress than you did a decade ago. Your sense of humour has evolved, your values have shifted, your fears and hopes have transformed. The patterns of thought and feeling that seem most essentially you are actually quite fluid when examined across long enough time periods. Perhaps identity lies in something more abstract, the particular combination of history, relationships, and accumulated experience that shapes how you engage with the world. But history gets reinterpreted, relationships change and end and begin, experience gets filtered through the lens of current understanding. Even these more abstract candidates for the essence of identity prove unstable when examined closely. The teletransportation paradox makes the puzzle of identity even more acute by imagining technology that could scan your entire body and brain down to the quantum level, then disintegrate you while simultaneously recreating you from different atoms in a distant location. The recreated version would have all your memories, personality traits, relationships, and physical characteristics. From both your perspective and everyone else's perspective, you would have travelled instantaneously across space. But have you actually travelled? Or have you died while a copy with your memories and personality has been created elsewhere? The copy would certainly believe it was you, would have all your memories of agreeing to the procedure, would wake up expecting to find itself in the destination location. It would feel like the same person who entered the teletransporter, would recognise friends and family, would continue conversations from where they left off. The paradox becomes even more troubling when you imagine that the teletransporter malfunctions, creating the copy at the destination while failing to disintegrate the original. Now there are two beings with equal claim to being you, both with identical memories up to the point of teletransportation, both feeling like the real you, both recognised as you by everyone who knows you. Which one is really you? The original who stayed behind would argue that continuity of physical existence proves authentic identity. The copy who appeared at the destination would argue that psychological continuity, memories, personality, relationships, determines identity rather than mere physical continuity. Both would be equally convinced of their own authenticity and equally troubled by the existence of the other. Perhaps the question reveals a mistake in how you think about identity itself. Maybe there is no fact of the matter about which one is really you, because identity is not the kind of thing that has clear boundaries and definitive answers. Maybe identity is more like a story than a scientific fact, useful for practical purposes but not corresponding to any objective reality about what makes you you. Four-dimensional worm theory suggests a radically different way of thinking about persistence through time. Instead of imagining yourself as a three-dimensional object that somehow maintains identity while changing, the theory proposes that you are actually a four-dimensional object extended through time, like a worm is extended through space. From this perspective, the child you and the adult you are different temporal parts of the same four-dimensional entity. Like the head and tail of a worm are different spatial parts of the same three-dimensional entity. Just as the head of a worm is different from its tail while both being parts of one worm, the child you is different from the adult you while both being parts of one temporally extended person. This view dissolves many puzzles about identity by suggesting that change over time doesn't threaten identity, any more than differences across space threaten the identity of spatially extended objects. The worm theory explains how you can be both the same person and a different person at different times. You're the same four-dimensional entity, but different temporal parts of that entity. But the worm theory creates new puzzles even as it solves old ones. If you are a four-dimensional object, then your entire life, from birth to death, exists timelessly as a complete four-dimensional structure. The past doesn't cease to exist when it becomes past. It remains as real as the present, just located at a different temporal coordinate. This implies that your childhood self is not gone but continues to exist at earlier temporal coordinates, playing in playgrounds that are as real as the room you occupy now. Your future self already exists at later temporal coordinates, living through experiences that feel uncertain to you now, but are as fixed and definite as your past from the four-dimensional perspective. Time travel stories have always provided fertile ground for exploring the paradoxes of identity and causation. The grandfather paradox presents the classic puzzle. What happens if you travel back in time and prevent your grandparents from meeting, thereby preventing your own birth? If you're never born, how could you have travelled back in time to prevent your grandparents from meeting? The paradox seems to show that backwards time travel is impossible because it creates logical contradictions. But perhaps the paradox reveals something deeper about the nature of time and causation. Maybe time travel is possible, but the universe has mechanisms that prevent paradoxes. Perhaps you would find yourself unable to significantly alter the past, or perhaps your attempts to change history would inadvertently cause the very events you were trying to prevent. The bootstrap paradox creates even stranger logical loops. Imagine that you travel back in time and give Shakespeare a collection of plays that he will later write. Shakespeare publishes the plays under his own name, becoming the famous playwright whose works you later travel back in time to give him. Where did the plays originally come from? Shakespeare didn't create them, he received them from you. But you didn't create them either, you got them from Shakespeare. The information contained in the plays seems to exist without ever being created, trapped in a causal loop where every event depends on later events, in a way that makes the entire sequence seem impossible, yet the loop is internally consistent. Each event in the sequence has a cause, even though the sequence as a whole has no beginning. Bootstrap paradoxes suggest that causation might be more complex than the simple linear sequence of cause and effect that everyday thinking assumes. Perhaps some events can be self-causing, or perhaps the universe can contain causal loops that are stable, even though they have no ultimate origin. Einstein's twin paradox demonstrates how time itself becomes fluid when objects travel at high speeds relative to each other. If one twin travels to a distant star at nearly the speed of light, while the other remains on Earth, the travelling twin will age more slowly due to time dilation. When the travelling twin returns, she will be younger than her Earthbound sibling. The paradox raises puzzling questions about the nature of aging and identity. Is the travelling twin the same age as her sibling minus the time difference? Or is she actually younger in some more fundamental sense? Has she experienced less time, or has time itself passed differently for her? If personal identity is tied to accumulated experience and psychological development, which twin has lived longer? The twin paradox also suggests that simultaneity, the question of what it means for events to happen at the same time, depends on the frame of reference from which you observe them. Events that are simultaneous from the Earth twin's perspective happen at different times from the space twin's perspective. There is no universal now that applies throughout the universe. This relativity of simultaneity implies that the four-dimensional worm theory might be more than just a philosophical thought experiment. If there is no universal present moment, then perhaps all moments in time are equally real, equally now from their own perspective. The past and future might be as real as the present, just located at different coordinates in the four-dimensional space-time structure. Friedrich Nietzsche imagined a terrible possibility: eternal recurrence, the idea that your entire life, every moment, every decision, every joy and suffering might repeat exactly as it has happened, infinite times. Not reincarnation into a different life, but the identical repetition of this life, down to every detail, forever. The thought experiment asks how you would feel if you knew that everything you do has been done before in exactly the same way, and will be done again in exactly the same way infinitely many times. Would this knowledge change how you live? Would it make your choices feel more meaningful because they echo through eternity, or less meaningful because they are trapped in endless repetition? Eternal recurrence suggests a test for evaluating your life. Can you affirm your existence completely, embracing not just the good moments, but also the pain, the mistakes, the boredom, the suffering? If you had to live this exact life infinite times, would you choose to live it at all? The thought experiment doesn't require belief in literal eternal recurrence to be meaningful. It asks you to imagine loving your life enough to want to repeat it exactly, to find meaning and value even in experiences you would prefer to avoid, to take responsibility for your choices by imagining their eternal repetition. Heraclitus observed that you cannot step into the same river twice, because new waters are constantly flowing through it. But the metaphor becomes more complex when you realize that you cannot step into the same river twice because you yourself are different each time you step. The river changes and you change, making every moment of contact between yourself and the world a meeting between things that have never encountered each other before. The river you cannot step in twice suggests that identity is more like a process than a thing, more like a pattern of activity than a stable entity. You're not the same person from moment to moment any more than the river is the same collection of water molecules from moment to moment. Yet there is continuity, coherence, recognizable pattern that persists through constant change. This process view of identity offers a different resolution to the puzzles about persistence through time. Instead of asking what remains the same as you change, you can ask what pattern of activity constitutes your identity at any given moment. Instead of looking for an essential self that persists through time, you can recognize yourself as an ongoing process of becoming rather than a fixed state of being. The growing block universe presents a compromise between the common-sense view that only the present exists and the four-dimensional view that all times are equally real. According to this theory, the past and present exist, but the future does not yet exist. Reality grows moment by moment as new slices of the present become real and join the accumulating block of past events. This view preserves the intuition that there is something special about the present moment. It is the boundary between what exists, past and present, and what doesn't yet exist, future. It allows for genuine becoming and change while acknowledging that the past doesn't simply vanish when it becomes past. But the growing block theory creates new puzzles about identity. If you are extended through time but only up to the present moment, then what exactly are you? Are you the entire history of your existence up to now, or just the current slice? If only part of your four-dimensional extension exists at any given moment, in what sense do you persist as a complete entity? The problem of personal identity encompasses all these puzzles and more, asking what makes you the same person over time despite the constant changes in your body, mind, personality, and circumstances. Philosophers have proposed many answers: continuity of memory, continuity of personality, continuity of the soul, continuity of the brain, continuity of psychological connections, continuity of narrative self-understanding. Each proposed solution faces counterexamples and difficulties. Memory can be lost or false. Personality can change dramatically. The soul is unobservable. The brain can be damaged or replaced. Psychological connections can be disrupted. Narrative self-understanding can be mistaken or revised. Perhaps the problem itself rests on a false assumption, that there is a fact of the matter about personal identity that philosophy can discover. Maybe identity is not a natural phenomenon that exists independently of human practices and concerns, but rather a social construction that serves practical purposes without corresponding to objective reality. Or perhaps the problem reveals something important about the nature of consciousness and selfhood that cannot be captured by purely physical or psychological descriptions. Maybe the sense of being a unified self persisting through time points to something real about the structure of conscious experience that science has not yet learned to measure or explain. The thought experiments about time and identity work together to create a kind of temporal vertigo, a dizzying recognition that the seemingly solid ground of selfhood might be more fluid than everyday experience suggests. They reveal that the simple question, "Who are you?" opens into vast territories of philosophical complexity, where common sense meets paradox and certainty gives way to mystery. But they also illuminate something profound about the human condition. You live suspended between past and future, carrying the weight of history, while reaching toward possibilities that remain uncertain. Your identity emerges from this temporal suspension, neither purely determined by what has happened nor completely free to become anything at all. The experiment suggests that you might be less like a thing and more like a story. Not a fixed entity, but an ongoing narrative that weaves together memory and anticipation, continuity and change, pattern and possibility. The story has no single author and no predetermined ending. It emerges from the complex interaction between the person you have been, the circumstances you encounter, and the choices you make in response to uncertainty. Understanding identity as narrative rather than substance doesn't eliminate the mystery but relocates it. Instead of asking what makes you the same person over time, you can ask what makes your story coherent, meaningful, worth continuing. Instead of looking for the essential self beneath the changes, you can recognize the self as emerging from the process of change itself. You are both the author and the protagonist of a story that began before you were conscious enough to shape it, and will likely continue in ways you cannot predict or control. The story includes elements you would not have chosen, and developments you cannot fully understand. But it remains, in some meaningful sense, your story. The unique trajectory through time and possibility that no one else could have traced. The thought experiments about time and identity do not provide definitive answers about what you are or who you will become. They offer something perhaps more valuable, an appreciation for the complexity and mystery of existing as a conscious being suspended in time, changing constantly while somehow remaining recognizably yourself, carrying the past while reaching toward an uncertain future, participating in the strange adventure of being human in a universe where identity itself remains one of the deepest puzzles. Where does morality come from? What happens when rules collide? The questions arrive disguised as simple choices that turn out to be anything but simple. You're walking past a pond when you notice a child drowning. Saving the child would require ruining your expensive shoes and making you late for an important meeting. The choice seems obvious. Of course, you save the child. But then someone points out that the money you spent on those shoes could have saved several children in distant countries from preventable diseases. Why does proximity matter? Why does the immediacy of drowning seem more morally urgent than the slower tragedy of malnutrition? Moral intuitions that feel rock solid in familiar contexts begin to wobble when examined from different angles, when consequences are extended across time and space, when the stakes are raised or the circumstances shifted slightly. The certainty that accompanies moral judgment starts to feel less like contact with objective truth, and more like the particular perspective of a particular kind of creature, trying to navigate a complex world with incomplete information and competing values. Yet something about moral questions feels inescapable, unavoidable, necessary in ways that other philosophical puzzles don't. You can live with uncertainty about the nature of consciousness or the persistence of identity. But you have to make moral choices constantly. Small ones about honesty and kindness and fairness, large ones about how to live and what to value, and when to sacrifice your own interests for others. The thought experiments that explore moral terrain don't provide clear answers to these pressing questions. Instead, they illuminate the complexity that lies beneath seemingly simple moral judgments, revealing the assumptions and intuitions that guide ethical thinking, while exposing the tensions and contradictions that arise when those intuitions encounter unusual circumstances. A runaway trolley speeds toward 5 people tied to the tracks. You stand next to a lever that can divert the trolley to a side track, where it will kill 1 person instead of 5. Do you pull the lever? Most people say yes. The trolley problem, introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot and developed by Judith Jarvis Thompson, seems to present a straightforward utilitarian calculation. 5 lives outweigh 1 life, so the action that saves the most people is morally required. The arithmetic feels clear, even if the emotional weight of causing someone's death makes the choice difficult. But then consider a variation. You're standing on a bridge above the trolley tracks. Next to you is a large person whose body would be heavy enough to stop the trolley if pushed off the bridge. The same 5 people are in danger. The same arithmetic applies. 1 death prevents 5 deaths. Yet most people find pushing the large person morally unacceptable, even though the consequences are identical to pulling the lever. This Fat Man variation reveals that moral judgment involves more than simple consequence calculation. Something about using a person's body as a means to save others feels fundamentally different from diverting a trolley, even when the outcomes are the same. The difference points to competing moral frameworks, one that focuses on consequences and another that focuses on the nature of actions themselves. The trolley problems multiply endlessly. What if the 1 person on the sidetrack is your child and the 5 people are strangers? What if the 5 people are convicted criminals and the 1 person is an innocent child? What if you're the trolley driver and diverting would save 5 passengers but kill 1 pedestrian? What if the 5 people chose to be on the tracks while the 1 person was placed there against their will? Each variation tugs at different moral intuitions, revealing how context shapes ethical judgment in ways that simple rules cannot capture. The problem suggests that moral reasoning involves a complex interplay between consequences, intentions, relationships, rights, duties, and emotional responses that resist reduction to any single principle or formula. Real-world moral dilemmas often resemble trolley problems more than the clear-cut choices that moral education typically assumes. Medical triage during emergencies, resource allocation during disasters, policy decisions about public health measures, all involve variations of the basic question. When is it acceptable to harm some people to help others, and what factors determine the acceptability? Modern technology has made trolley problems literal rather than hypothetical. Autonomous vehicles must be programmed with algorithms that make split-second decisions about whom to harm when accidents become unavoidable. Should the car swerve to avoid pedestrians even if it endangers passengers? Should it prioritize young people over old people, healthy people over sick people, 1 person over many people? The choices that philosophers explored as thought experiments now require explicit programming decisions that will determine actual life and death outcomes. Robert Nozick imagined an experience machine that could provide you with any experiences you desired while you remained unconscious in a tank, fed by tubes and stimulated by electrodes. The machine could simulate the experience of writing great novels, having perfect relationships, achieving extraordinary success, and experiencing constant happiness. Once plugged in, you would never know the difference between the simulated experiences and reality. Would you plug in? Nozick argued that most people would not, and that this reluctance reveals something important about human values. If happiness and positive experiences were all that mattered morally, then the experience machine would be the ultimate good, providing maximum pleasure with no risk of pain or failure. But the widespread reluctance to plug in suggests that people value more than just their experiences. They want to actually accomplish things, not just experience accomplishing things. They want genuine relationships with real people, not just the experience of such relationships. They want to be certain kinds of people, not just experience being those kinds of people. The experience machine challenges purely experiential theories of well-being and moral value. It suggests that what makes life valuable includes not just how it feels from the inside, but also how it connects to reality outside consciousness. Authenticity, achievement, genuine connection, and real impact seem to matter in ways that can't be captured by focusing solely on the quality of subjective experience. But the machine also raises uncomfortable questions about how much current life already resembles a kind of experience machine. Social media provides curated experiences of connection and achievement. Entertainment provides simulated adventures and emotions. Consumer culture promises happiness through the accumulation of experiences and possessions. How different is the choice to plug into an experience machine from the choice to spend hours each day engaged with screens that provide simulated experiences of various kinds? Nozick also proposed the utility monster, a being capable of experiencing vastly more pleasure from resources than ordinary people. If such a creature existed, utilitarian ethics would seem to require giving it everything, since resources would produce more total happiness when consumed by the monster than when distributed among regular people. The utility monster challenges the utilitarian focus on maximizing total happiness by revealing how that focus could justify extreme inequality. If one being's capacity for pleasure far exceeds everyone else's, then utilitarian logic would demand sacrificing everyone else's well-being to feed the monster's enormous appetite for happiness. The thought experiment reveals the tension between maximizing total utility and maintaining fair distribution of resources. Most people feel that extreme inequality is morally problematic, even if it maximizes total happiness. But this intuition conflicts with the utilitarian principle that moral value lies in producing the greatest good for the greatest number. Modern discussions of global inequality sometimes echo the utility monster problem. If resources produce more happiness when given to extremely poor people than when kept by wealthy people, does morality require massive redistribution of wealth? How much inequality can be justified by pointing to overall improvements in total welfare? When does the pursuit of maximum total happiness conflict with other moral values like fairness, desert, and individual rights? Immanuel Kant posed a thought experiment about a man whose wife has been murdered by someone seeking refuge in their home. When the murderer arrives and asks whether the wife is inside, Kant's axe murderer scenario asks whether lying to protect an innocent person can ever be morally justified. Kant argued that lying is always wrong because moral principles must be universal, applicable to everyone in all circumstances. If everyone lied whenever they thought the consequences would be good, then trust and communication would become impossible. The moral rule against lying must apply even when telling the truth seems likely to cause harm. Most people find Kant's conclusion counterintuitive. Lying to protect innocent people from murderers seems not just permissible, but morally required. The axe murderer scenario illustrates the conflict between moral systems that focus on consequences and those that focus on the inherent nature of actions. But Kant's position reveals something important about moral reasoning. If moral principles apply only when they produce good consequences, then they aren't really principles at all. They're just rules of thumb that can be abandoned whenever circumstances change. True moral principles must provide guidance even in difficult situations where following them comes at significant cost. The axe murderer scenario also raises questions about moral responsibility for consequences beyond your direct control. If you tell the truth and the murderer kills someone, are you responsible for that death? If you lie and the murderer finds the person anyway through other means, are you responsible for the delay that might have prevented escape? How much responsibility do you bear for consequences that flow from your actions through the choices of other moral agents? Contemporary discussions of cancel culture, whistleblowing, and civil disobedience often involves similar tensions between honesty and consequences, between following rules and protecting people, between individual integrity and collective harm. Judith Jarvis Thomson's violinist thought experiment challenges common intuitions about moral obligation and bodily autonomy. Imagine waking up to find yourself connected by tubes to an unconscious violinist whose kidneys have failed. You've been kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers and connected to the violinist's circulatory system to keep him alive for 9 months while his kidneys recover. The violinist is innocent and will die if you disconnect yourself. But you never consented to this arrangement, and remaining connected severely restricts your freedom and autonomy for 9 months. Do you have a moral obligation to stay connected? Thomson argued that you have no such obligation, even though the violinist is innocent and will die without your help. The right to control your own body outweighs the violinist's need for your assistance, even when that need is a matter of life and death. The violinist scenario was designed to illuminate debates about abortion by separating questions of fetal personhood from questions of bodily autonomy. Even if a fetus is considered a person with a right to life, Thomson argued, that doesn't automatically create an obligation for the pregnant person to provide their body as life support. But the experiment raises broader questions about the limits of moral obligation. How much sacrifice are you required to make to help others? When does helping others become a moral duty rather than a praiseworthy choice? How do competing rights to life, to bodily autonomy, to freedom get balanced when they conflict? The violinist scenario also illustrates how thought experiments can change moral discussions by making abstract principles concrete. Instead of debating general principles about rights and obligations, you can consider specific scenarios and ask what you would actually do, what you think would be justified, what kinds of reasons would be relevant to the decision. A ship carrying more passengers than the lifeboats can accommodate begins to sink. The lifeboat problem asks how to decide who gets a place in the lifeboats and who is left behind to die. Should places go to those who bought first-class tickets, to women and children, to the youngest passengers, to those with the most dependents, to those who paid the most taxes, to whoever gets there first? The lifeboat scenario forces explicit reasoning about what makes one life more valuable than another. What criteria justify life and death decisions when resources are scarce? How to balance competing claims of desert, need, social value, and fair procedure. Different moral frameworks suggest different answers. Utilitarianism might favour saving those who would contribute most to total happiness, perhaps young, healthy people with good prospects for long, productive lives. Rights-based approaches might focus on fair procedures rather than outcomes, ensuring that everyone has an equal chance regardless of characteristics beyond their control. The lifeboat problem becomes a metaphor for broader questions about resource distribution, medical triage, disaster response, and global justice. Earth itself can be seen as a kind of lifeboat, with limited resources to support its passengers. Climate change, pandemic response, and international development all involve versions of the basic question: when not everyone can be saved, how do you decide who gets priority? Modern medical ethics confronts literal lifeboat problems during emergencies, when hospitals must decide how to allocate scarce resources like ventilators, intensive care beds, and organs for transplant. The COVID-19 pandemic made these decisions routine rather than exceptional, forcing healthcare systems to develop explicit criteria for rationing life-saving treatment. Peter Singer proposed the survival lottery as a thought experiment about the moral logic of saving lives. Imagine a society where healthy people are randomly selected and killed so their organs can be harvested to save multiple people who would otherwise die from organ failure. One death prevents 5 deaths, maximising the number of lives saved. Most people reject the survival lottery as morally abhorrent, but Singer argued that this rejection reveals inconsistency in moral thinking. If we believe that governments should spend money on preventing deaths from disease rather than on luxury goods, then we accept the principle that preventing deaths justifies significant costs and sacrifices. Why is it acceptable to require financial sacrifice to save lives but not physical sacrifice? The survival lottery pushes utilitarian logic to its extreme, revealing how the principle of maximizing welfare can justify practices that feel fundamentally wrong. The thought experiment suggests that moral intuitions about individual rights, fairness, and the sanctity of life sometimes conflict with the goal of saving the most lives possible. But the lottery also raises questions about the difference between killing and letting die, between intended consequences and merely foreseen consequences, between what individuals should do and what institutions should do. Perhaps the moral frameworks that apply to personal decisions don't scale up to social policies, or perhaps different moral principles apply to different spheres of the life. Lawrence Kohlberg's Heinz Dilemma presents a man whose wife is dying from cancer. A local druggist has discovered a cure but charges 10 times what it costs to make, pricing it beyond Heinz's ability to pay. The druggist refuses to lower the price or allow Heinz to pay later. Should Heinz steal the drug to save his wife? The dilemma is designed to reveal different levels of moral reasoning rather than to identify the correct answer. Some people focus on rules. Stealing is wrong regardless of circumstances. Others focus on consequences. Saving a life justifies breaking the law. Still others focus on principles. The right to life outweighs property rights, or people have obligations to help family members that override other considerations. Kohlberg argued that these different responses reflect developmental stages in moral reasoning, from simple rule following through cost-benefit analysis to principled reasoning about justice and universal moral laws. But other researchers have questioned whether this hierarchy reflects cultural bias rather than universal moral development. The Heinz dilemma also illustrates how moral problems often involve conflicts between different types of values: legal and moral, individual and social, immediate and long-term. The most difficult moral questions rarely involve choosing between good and evil, but rather choosing between competing goods or lesser evils when perfect solutions don't exist. Contemporary versions of the Heinz dilemma arise in debates about intellectual property, healthcare access, civil disobedience, and global justice. When pharmaceutical companies charge high prices for life-saving medications, when governments enforce immigration laws that separate families, when activists break laws to protest injustice. These situations involve the same basic tension between following rules and preventing harm. The ethical thought experiments work together to reveal moral reasoning as far more complex than the simple rule-following that everyday moral education often assumes. They show how seemingly clear moral principles break down when circumstances become unusual, how different moral frameworks can justify completely different actions, how moral intuitions that feel obvious can conflict with each other in systematic ways. But the experiments also reveal something remarkable about human moral capacity. Even when moral principles conflict, even when consequences are uncertain, even when perfect solutions are impossible, people continue to make moral judgments and take moral stands. The capacity for ethical reasoning persists even in the face of moral complexity that defeats simple formulas and clear rules. Perhaps the value of ethical thought experiments lies not in providing definitive answers to moral questions, but in developing the kind of moral imagination that can navigate complexity with wisdom and humility. They train attention to considerations that might otherwise be overlooked, reveal assumptions that might otherwise remain unconscious, and create space for moral reasoning that goes beyond immediate intuition or social convention. The experiments suggest that morality might be less like a set of rules to follow, and more like a skill to develop. The skill of reasoning carefully about how to live well in relationship with others, how to balance competing values when they conflict, how to make decisions that honour both individual dignity and collective well-being. In the end, the thought experiments about ethics return you to the practical reality of having to choose how to live. They don't eliminate the difficulty of moral choice, but they can make you a more thoughtful participant in the ongoing human conversation about how to treat each other with wisdom, compassion, and justice in a world where moral certainty remains elusive but moral choice remains unavoidable. Are you choosing anything at all, or just watching yourself choose? The question surfaces in quiet moments when you catch yourself acting on autopilot, reaching for your phone without deciding to check it, taking the same route to work without considering alternatives, responding to someone's comment with words that emerge before you've consciously chosen them. In these moments, you might wonder where your choices actually come from, whether the sense of being in control of your actions is real or simply a convincing story your mind tells about decisions that have already been made by processes you don't understand or influence. The feeling of free will seems undeniable from the inside. When you deliberate about what to do, the future genuinely feels open, filled with possibilities that depend on your choice. The weight of decision presses on you precisely because you experience yourself as capable of going either way. Yet science reveals a world of cause and effect where everything that happens follows from what came before according to natural laws. Every movement of your body, every firing of neurons in your brain, every thought and feeling emerges from prior physical states that were themselves determined by earlier states stretching back to the beginning of time. The tension between experienced freedom and causal determinism creates what philosophers call the problem of free will, perhaps the most personally urgent puzzle in philosophy, because it touches the foundation of moral responsibility, personal meaning, and human dignity. If your actions are the inevitable products of forces beyond your control, then what sense does it make to praise or blame anyone for anything? What becomes of choice, effort, regret, pride, and all the other experiences that seem to depend on being genuinely free agents in an open future? Jorge Luis Borges imagined the Garden of Forking Paths, a labyrinth of time where every possible choice creates a branch in reality, spawning infinite parallel worlds where every possibility gets realized. In one world you turn left, in another you turn right. In one world you speak the words that end a relationship, in another you remain silent and it continues. Every moment branches into countless futures, all equally real, all equally actual. The garden suggests one possible resolution to the tension between free will and determinism. Perhaps you do make genuine choices, but those choices don't eliminate the alternatives. They simply determine which branch of reality you experience, while other versions of yourself experience the roads not taken. Your choice to read these words instead of doing something else doesn't make the alternative choices less real. It just determines which timeline you inhabit. This many worlds interpretation of choice preserves the reality of decision-making, while acknowledging that everything that could happen does happen somewhere in the vast garden of forking paths. Every possible conversation gets spoken, every possible book gets written, every possible life gets lived by some version of every person who ever exists. But the Garden of Forking Paths also raises troubling questions about the significance of choice. If every possibility gets realized somewhere, then what difference do your particular choices make? Why should you care about choosing wisely if unwise versions of yourself are making foolish choices in parallel worlds? Does moral responsibility mean anything if every possible action gets performed by some version of every moral agent? Perhaps the garden preserves free will only by draining it of meaning. If everything happens somewhere, then nothing you choose prevents any alternative from happening. The responsibility for a choice becomes distributed across all possible versions of yourself, diluting individual accountability until it disappears entirely. The Laplace's demon represents the ultimate challenge to free will, an intelligence that knows the position and momentum of every particle in the universe and understands all the laws of physics perfectly. Such a being could, in principle, calculate the entire future of the universe with perfect accuracy. Every human action, every thought, every choice would be as predictable as the orbit of planets or the trajectory of falling objects. Pierre-Simon Laplace proposed this thought experiment in 1814 to illustrate the logical implications of determinism. If the universe operates according to deterministic laws, and if those laws apply to human beings as much as to rocks and stars, then human behavior should be as predictable as any other physical phenomenon. The demon's perfect knowledge would reveal that the future is not open and undetermined, but rather fixed and inevitable. The demon doesn't need to exist for the argument to create problems for free will. The mere possibility that such prediction could work in principle suggests that human choices might be illusory, even if actual prediction remains impossible. Due to the complexity of calculation and the limitation of real-world knowledge, the theoretical predictability implied by physical determinism threatens the reality of genuine choice. Modern neuroscience has created something approaching Laplace's demon in limited domains. Brain imaging can sometimes predict simple decisions, whether someone will press a button with their left hand or right hand, several seconds before the person reports being aware of their decision. The neural activity that determines the choice appears to begin before conscious awareness of choosing. These experiments suggest that consciousness might be more observer than director, becoming aware of decisions after the underlying neural processes have already determined the outcome. The experience of choosing might be a kind of after-the-fact narrative that the brain constructs to make sense of actions that have already been initiated by unconscious processes. But quantum mechanics has complicated the picture painted by Laplace's demon. At the fundamental level, physical events appear to be truly random rather than deterministic. Radioactive decay, quantum measurement, and other subatomic phenomena seem to involve genuine chance that cannot be predicted even in principle. The universe might be neither deterministic nor under conscious control, but rather driven by a combination of causal necessity and random chance. Random events don't rescue free will. Actions that result from quantum randomness are no more freely chosen than actions that result from deterministic causation. Whether your decisions emerge from inevitable physical processes or from chance events equally beyond your control, they don't seem to be genuinely yours in the way that moral responsibility and personal meaning seem to require. Harry Frankfurt proposed a different approach to the problem through cases that separate moral responsibility from the ability to have done otherwise. Frankfurt cases involve scenarios where someone chooses to perform an action that they would have been forced to perform even if they had chosen differently. Imagine that Jones decides to rob a bank and carries out the robbery. Unknown to Jones, Smith has been monitoring his thoughts and would have used advanced neurotechnology to force Jones to rob the bank if he had begun to change his mind. Since Jones never changes his mind, Smith's intervention device remains unused. Frankfurt argued that Jones is fully responsible for robbing the bank despite the fact that he could not have done otherwise. Smith's presence ensures that the bank would have been robbed regardless of Jones's choice, but since Jones chose to rob it without coercion, he bears full moral responsibility for the action. The Frankfurt case suggests that moral responsibility might not require the ability to have acted differently. What matters is not whether alternative possibilities exist, but whether the action flows from the agent's own will, values, and character. You can be responsible for actions you couldn't have avoided if those actions genuinely express your own agency, rather than external force. But Frankfurt cases also raise questions about what it means for an action to be genuinely your own. If your will, values, and character are themselves the products of factors beyond your control, genetics, upbringing, social environment, brain chemistry, then in what sense are actions that flow from them freely chosen? The regress of responsibility threatens to eliminate agency entirely, unless it stops at some level that counts as genuinely yours. The locked room scenario presents a simpler version of the same puzzle. Imagine you're in a room with only one exit, but you don't want to leave anyway. The locked door doesn't restrict your freedom because you have no desire to go elsewhere. You remain in the room by choice despite being physically unable to leave. The locked room illustrates how external constraints don't necessarily eliminate freedom when they don't conflict with what you want to do anyway. But it also reveals how difficult it is to distinguish between free action and constrained action when the constraints align with your preferences. Your preferences themselves might be the result of constraints you don't recognize. Social conditioning, cultural expectations, biological drives, and unconscious influences all shape what you want in ways that you rarely examine or choose. The room of your desires might be locked from the inside in ways that make the constraints invisible, while still limiting your freedom. The Puppet Master thought experiment pushes these concerns to their extreme by imagining a being who controls your every action through invisible strings attached to your nervous system. You move your arms, speak words, and make facial expressions, but every motion is actually controlled by the Puppet Master pulling the appropriate strings. From your perspective, the actions feel voluntary. You experience deciding to wave your hand, and then your hand waves. You experience choosing your words, and then you speak them. The Puppet Master's control is so subtle that it never conflicts with your conscious intentions. Instead, it shapes those intentions so that you always want to do exactly what the puppet master wants you to do. The puppet master scenario suggests that the experience of free will might be compatible with complete external control. If the control operates at the level of desires and intentions rather than fighting against them, then you might be thoroughly manipulated while feeling completely free. But the scenario also raises questions about what would count as genuine freedom. If you want to do what the puppet master wants you to do, and if your actions flow from your own desires, even though those desires are externally controlled, are you free or unfree? Does the source of your wants matter, as long as you're able to act on them? Modern technology creates increasingly realistic versions of puppet master scenarios. Social media algorithms shape your preferences by controlling what information you encounter. Advertising uses psychological research to influence your desires. Political messaging uses sophisticated techniques to modify your beliefs and values. The control operates not through obvious coercion, but through subtle manipulation of the information environment that shapes your thoughts and preferences. Thomas Nagel introduced the concept of moral luck to describe situations where factors beyond your control significantly influence your moral standing. A careful driver who hits a child who runs into the street bears different moral responsibility than an equally careful driver whose route happens not to cross paths with any children, even though the difference in outcomes results from luck rather than choice. Moral luck appears in many forms. Constitutional luck determines your basic temperament, abilities, and psychological makeup. Circumstantial luck determines the situations you encounter and the options available to you. Antecedent luck shapes your upbringing, education, and formative experiences. Resultant luck determines the consequences of your actions in ways you cannot predict or control. The pervasiveness of moral luck threatens to undermine moral responsibility entirely. If your character, circumstances, choices, and their consequences all depend significantly on factors beyond your control, then how can you be genuinely responsible for anything? The careful driver and the unlucky driver seem equally deserving of praise or blame for their driving, yet one bears the weight of having killed a child, while the other goes home feeling virtuous. But moral luck also reveals something important about the human condition. You live in a world where you must make choices with incomplete information about uncertain consequences, where your best efforts can lead to terrible outcomes and your careless moments can produce unexpected benefits. Moral responsibility emerges not from perfect control, but from the attempt to choose well within the constraints and uncertainties that define human existence. Benjamin Libert's famous experiments used EEG to measure brain activity while people made simple decisions about when to move their hands. The experiments revealed that neural activity associated with the decision began several hundred milliseconds before people reported being conscious of their intention to move. The timing suggested that unconscious brain processes initiate actions before conscious awareness of the decision occurs. Consciousness seems to become aware of choices after the underlying neural commitment has already been made, challenging the intuitive notion that conscious will directs behaviour. Libert himself interpreted the results more carefully, suggesting that consciousness might retain free won't, the ability to veto actions that have been unconsciously initiated. The conscious mind might not start actions but could still stop them, preserving a limited form of free will, even within a largely deterministic system. But subsequent experiments have complicated even this limited rescue of free will. Some studies suggest that the decision to veto an action can itself be predicted from neural activity, occurring before conscious awareness. The veto might be just as unconsciously determined as the original action. The black box mind thought experiment asks you to imagine that your brain is replaced with a functionally identical artificial device that produces all the same behaviours, thoughts, and experiences as your original brain. The black box receives sensory inputs and generates motor outputs that perfectly mimic your original patterns of response, but its internal operations remain completely opaque. Would you be free if your mind were such a black box? The device would generate all your apparent choices, desires, and decisions, but you would have no insight into how those mental states arise, or whether they could have been different. The experience of choosing would remain, but the causal history of choice would be hidden behind the black box's impenetrable exterior. The black box reveals how little you actually know about your own decision-making processes. You experience the outputs of these processes, the thoughts, feelings, and intentions that emerge into consciousness, but you have virtually no access to the underlying mechanisms that generate them. Your mind might already be a kind of black box whose operations remain mysterious even to itself. If free will depends on understanding and controlling the processes that generate your choices, then the black box problem suggests that you already lack free will. But if free will is compatible with having choices emerge from processes you don't understand or control, then the black box preserves freedom by preserving the experience and reality of choosing. The hidden levers extend the black box metaphor by imagining that your behavior is controlled by mechanisms that operate below the threshold of awareness, but that could potentially be discovered and manipulated. Perhaps your choices are determined by factors like blood sugar levels, sleep patterns, social pressures, and environmental cues that influence your decisions in predictable ways. The hidden levers suggest that free will might be a matter of degree rather than an all-or-nothing property. The more you understand about the factors that influence your choices, the more control you might be able to exercise over them. Self-knowledge becomes a form of freedom, expanding your ability to shape your own behavior by making unconscious influences conscious. But the hidden levers also suggest that perfect freedom might be impossible. The factors that influence your choices extend far beyond your ability to monitor or control them. Social dynamics, cultural conditioning, biological drives, and unconscious psychological processes all pull on the levers of choice in ways that remain largely hidden even when you're looking for them. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment in physics provides a metaphor for thinking about free will that transcends the simple dichotomy between determinism and randomness. In these experiments, the behavior of quantum particles appears to be retroactively influenced by measurements that occur after the particles have already interacted with detection equipment. The experiment suggests that causation might be more complex than the simple forward flow of influence from past to future that everyday thinking assumes. Perhaps choice and determinism interact in ways that can't be captured by thinking of the future as either fixed or completely open. If consciousness operates according to principles analogous to quantum mechanics, then your choices might exist in a kind of superposition until the moment of decision collapses the possibilities into actuality. The experience of choosing might be the subjective correlate of this collapse, making free will real even within a universe governed by natural laws. But quantum mechanics also suggests that your choices might influence the past as well as the future in ways that create temporal loops of causation. The person you choose to become retroactively determines the kind of person who would make such choices, creating a kind of self-consistency that transcends simple forward causation. The thought experiments about free will and determinism work together to create a profound sense of vertigo about the nature of human agency. They reveal how the experience of choosing, which feels so immediate and undeniable, becomes deeply mysterious when examined closely. They show how difficult it is to locate genuine freedom in a world of causes and effects, yet how equally difficult it is to abandon the practices and attitudes that seem to require free will. But perhaps the experiments point toward a more nuanced understanding of human agency that doesn't require perfect freedom to preserve moral responsibility and personal meaning. You might be partially free agents operating within complex networks of influence and constraint, capable of genuine choice within limits you don't fully understand or control. The experiment suggests that freedom might be something you create rather than something you simply possess, something that emerges from the ongoing interaction between consciousness, character, circumstance, and choice. The reality of agency might depend not on escaping all constraints, but on developing the capacity to respond thoughtfully to the constraints you encounter. In this view, free will becomes less like a metaphysical property and more like a skill. The skill of reflective self-direction, of taking responsibility for your actions even within the limits of knowledge and control, of shaping your character and circumstances in ways that expand your capacity for meaningful choice. You remain suspended between freedom and necessity, capable of genuine choice yet embedded in causal networks that extend far beyond your understanding or influence. The thought experiments don't resolve this suspension, but help you inhabit it more thoughtfully, with appropriate humility about your limitations and appropriate appreciation for the agency you do possess. Whether you're freely choosing to continue listening to these ideas or simply following the inevitable trajectory of neural processes that were set in motion long before you were born, you're participating in the remarkable phenomenon of consciousness, encountering questions about its own nature and finding them both troubling and beautiful, both impossible to answer definitively and impossible to stop asking. What happens when you change the system or pretend it doesn't exist? The questions emerge when you step back far enough from the daily routines of civilization to see them with fresh eyes. Why do people wait in orderly lines instead of pushing to the front? Why do strangers trust pieces of paper and digital numbers as stores of value? Why do some people live in mansions while others sleep in doorways? And why does this arrangement persist when it could be changed by collective decision? The invisible architecture of society surrounds you so completely that it becomes nearly impossible to see. Laws, customs, institutions, and expectations create the background against which individual life unfolds, shaping possibilities and constraints in ways that feel natural and inevitable until you imagine how different everything could be. The social world that seems solid and permanent reveals itself, under examination, to be a collective construction that could be dismantled and rebuilt according to different principles. Yet the apparent arbitrariness of social arrangements doesn't make them unimportant. The difference between just and unjust societies can mean the difference between flourishing and suffering for millions of people. The question of how to organize collective life, how to balance freedom and equality, individual rights and social needs, efficiency and fairness remains as urgent now as it was when the first human communities grappled with these tensions. The thought experiments that explore society, justice, and power ask you to imagine yourself into different worlds, to consider what you would choose if you could design society from scratch, to examine the hidden assumptions that make current arrangements seem necessary rather than contingent. John Rawls invited you to step behind a veil of ignorance that would hide all knowledge about your particular place in society. You wouldn't know whether you'd be rich or poor, talented or struggling, healthy or sick, male or female, young or old, from any particular race, religion, or cultural background. From this original position, what kind of society would you choose to live in? Rawls argued that rational people behind the veil of ignorance would choose a society organised around two principles: maximum equal liberty for all citizens and social and economic inequalities arranged to benefit the least advantaged members of society. Since you might end up being anyone, you would want to ensure that even the worst positions in society are as good as possible. The veil of ignorance functions like a moral telescope, allowing you to see social arrangements from a perspective unclouded by self-interest. When you don't know whether you'll be advantaged or disadvantaged by particular policies, you're more likely to choose policies that are genuinely fair rather than ones that happen to benefit your actual circumstances. But the veil also reveals how difficult it is to separate fairness from self-interest in practice. Your current advantages and disadvantages inevitably influence what you consider reasonable, what risks you're willing to take, what trade-offs you're prepared to accept. The person who has benefited from existing arrangements sees different possibilities behind the veil than the person who has suffered under those arrangements. Contemporary debates about universal healthcare, progressive taxation, affirmative action, and social safety nets often involve implicit appeals to the veil of ignorance. What would you choose if you didn't know whether you'd be born into wealth or poverty, health or sickness, privilege or discrimination? The veil provides a thought experiment for testing whether policies serve genuine justice or merely the interests of those who happen to benefit from them. But the veil of ignorance also raises questions about whether fairness requires eliminating all knowledge about human diversity and particular circumstances. Perhaps just societies need to account for real differences between people rather than pretending that everyone is interchangeable. Maybe the veil asks you to ignore morally relevant factors along with morally arbitrary ones. Thomas Hobbes imagined what life would be like in a state of nature before the establishment of government and law. Without institutions to enforce agreements and protect property, Hobbes argued, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. Everyone would be at war with everyone else in a desperate struggle for scarce resources and security. In the state of nature, you would have the right to do whatever you believed necessary for your survival, including killing others who threatened you. But this universal right to everything would make life impossible for everyone. No one could feel secure, no one could plan for the future, no one could engage in productive activities that required cooperation and trust. Hobbes argued that rational people in such circumstances would agree to surrender their natural rights to a sovereign authority in exchange for protection and the enforcement of rules that make social cooperation possible. The social contract creates civilization by establishing a power capable of punishing those who break agreements and threaten others. The Hobbesian vision suggests that government authority ultimately rests on consent. People agree to be governed because the alternative is worse. But it also suggests that this consent might be coerced by circumstances rather than freely given. If the choice is between accepting government authority and living in violent chaos, how meaningful is the consent? Modern events sometimes create conditions resembling Hobbes's state of nature. During natural disasters, economic collapses, or social upheavals, the normal institutions that maintain order can break down temporarily. These situations provide real-world tests of Hobbesian predictions about human behaviour in the absence of government authority. Sometimes people do become predatory and violent when institutional constraints disappear. But sometimes they organise mutual aid, share resources generously, and maintain cooperation without formal authority. The diversity of responses suggests that the state of nature might not have the uniform character that Hobbes imagined. Nozick's Wilt-Chamberlain argument challenges redistributive theories of justice by imagining a scenario where everyone starts with equal resources but freely chooses to pay basketball star Wilt Chamberlain to watch him play. After a season of games, Chamberlain has accumulated far more money than anyone else, creating significant inequality from an initially equal distribution. Nozick argued that this inequality is perfectly just because it arose from voluntary transactions that didn't harm anyone. Each person who paid to see Chamberlain play got what they wanted, entertainment, in exchange for what they gave up, money. Chamberlain provided something that people valued enough to pay for, so he deserves to keep what he earned. The argument suggests that patterned theories of distributive justice, theories that say resources should be distributed according to principles like equality or need, violate individual liberty. If people are free to make their own choices about what to do with their resources, then any initial pattern of distribution will be disrupted by voluntary exchanges. But the Wilt-Chamberlain scenario also raises questions about what makes exchanges truly voluntary. If some people start with more money than others, their ability to pay for entertainment is greater, regardless of how much they value the experience. If Chamberlain's basketball skills result partly from genetic advantages or superior coaching that others didn't have access to, his success isn't entirely self-made. Contemporary debates about wealth inequality, progressive taxation, and inherited advantage often echo the Chamberlain argument. Should society limit the inequalities that emerge from voluntary market transactions? When do voluntary exchanges reflect genuine freedom? And when do they reflect background inequalities that compromise the voluntariness of the exchange? Adam Smith's invisible hand suggests that individual pursuit of self-interest can produce collective benefits without anyone intending to serve the common good. When people buy and sell in competitive markets, trying to get the best deals for themselves, they inadvertently coordinate economic activity in ways that efficiently allocate resources and promote general prosperity. The baker doesn't bake bread from benevolence toward customers, but from self-interest in earning money. Yet this self-interested behaviour produces bread for everyone who wants it, at prices that reflect the true cost of production. The baker's profit motive aligns private incentives with public benefits, creating prosperity without requiring anyone to sacrifice their own interests for others. The invisible hand offers a powerful vision of social coordination that doesn't require central planning or moral transformation. People can remain selfish while still contributing to collective welfare through the magic of market mechanisms that channel private vices into public virtues. But the invisible hand also requires specific conditions to work properly: competitive markets, secure property rights, accurate information, minimal transaction costs, and the absence of significant externalities. When these conditions aren't met, the invisible hand can lead to market failures, where private interests diverge from public welfare. Modern discussions of climate change, financial regulation, income inequality, and corporate responsibility often involve questions about the limits of the invisible hand. When do market mechanisms produce socially beneficial outcomes, and when do they require correction through government intervention or moral constraint? The prisoner's dilemma illustrates how rational individual behaviour can produce collectively irrational outcomes. Two prisoners are arrested and held separately. Each is offered a deal: testify against the other prisoner and go free while the other serves a long sentence. If both testify, both serve medium sentences. If neither testifies, both serve short sentences. From each prisoner's individual perspective, testifying is the rational choice regardless of what the other prisoner does. If the other prisoner testifies, testifying avoids the worst outcome. If the other prisoner doesn't testify, testifying produces the best individual outcome. Yet if both prisoners follow this logic, they both end up worse off than if they had both remained silent. The dilemma reveals a fundamental tension between individual and collective rationality. What's best for each person individually produces what's worst for everyone collectively. The structure creates incentives for defection even when cooperation would benefit everyone. Prisoners' dilemmas appear throughout social life. Countries competing in arms races, companies competing by cutting wages, individuals competing by working longer hours, all can create situations where everyone ends up worse off despite each party acting rationally from their own perspective. But real-world prisoners' dilemmas often involve repeated interactions where reputation, trust, and long-term relationships can sustain cooperation despite short-term incentives to defect. The shadow of the future changes the strategic calculus, making cooperation more rational when players expect to interact again. Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons extends the prisoner's dilemma to situations involving shared resources. When multiple herders share a common pasture, each has an incentive to add more cattle to increase personal profit. But if everyone follows this logic, the pasture becomes overgrazed and destroyed, harming everyone. The tragedy occurs because the benefits of adding cattle accrue entirely to the individual herder, while the costs of overgrazing are shared among all users of the commons. This asymmetry between private benefits and social costs creates incentives for overuse that can destroy the resource that everyone depends on. Commons tragedies appear in many contemporary contexts: overfishing of ocean stocks, overuse of groundwater, contribution to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions, congestion of public roads and parks. Individual rationality leads to collective irrationality when shared resources lack effective governance mechanisms. But Hardin's analysis has been criticised for ignoring the many ways that communities have successfully managed common resources without destroying them. Elinor Ostrom's research revealed numerous examples of sustainable commons management through locally developed rules, monitoring systems, and enforcement mechanisms. The tragedy of the commons might be better understood as a problem of institutional design rather than inevitable human nature. When communities can develop appropriate governance mechanisms, they can often avoid tragic outcomes while preserving both individual freedom and collective resources. Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon was designed as a prison where guards could observe all prisoners, without the prisoners knowing whether they were being watched. The design created a psychological effect where prisoners would behave as if they were constantly under surveillance, even when no guard was actually watching. Michel Foucault extended the Panopticon metaphor to describe how modern societies exercise power through surveillance and the internalization of social norms. When people believe they might be watched, they regulate their own behavior according to social expectations, making external control less necessary. The Panopticon effect operates throughout contemporary society. Security cameras, data collection, social media monitoring, and performance metrics create environments where people modify their behavior based on the possibility of observation and valuation. The presence of surveillance changes behavior even when actual monitoring is limited or absent. Digital technology has created unprecedented panopticon capabilities. Smartphones track location and behavior patterns. Social media platforms monitor communications and relationships. Governments and corporations can observe activities that were previously private and invisible. But the digital panopticon also creates new possibilities for resistance and evasion. Encryption, anonymization tools, and decentralized networks can preserve privacy and autonomy in environments designed for surveillance. The same technologies that enable observation also enable hiding. Social contract games explore what happens when people can choose whether to participate in cooperative arrangements. In these scenarios, individuals decide whether to contribute to public goods, follow social rules, or support institutions that benefit everyone but require individual sacrifices. The games reveal the fragility of social cooperation when participation is voluntary. If enough people choose to free ride, benefiting from others' cooperation without contributing themselves, the cooperative arrangement can collapse, leaving everyone worse off than if they had found ways to sustain mutual cooperation. But social contract games also show how cooperation can emerge and stabilize through reputation effects, social norms, institutional design, and cultural evolution. Societies develop mechanisms for encouraging cooperation and discouraging free riding that can maintain public goods and social institutions across generations. Contemporary challenges like climate change, pandemic response, and global governance involve massive social contract games where billions of people must choose whether to cooperate for collective benefits that require individual costs. The success of these efforts depends partly on institutional design and partly on cultural norms that support cooperation despite individual incentives to free ride. The Perfect Dictator thought experiment asks what you would do if you had absolute power over society with no constraints from law, custom, or resistance. Would you use this power to maximize general welfare, to benefit yourself and your allies, or to pursue some vision of the good society regardless of what people actually want? The scenario reveals tensions between different conceptions of political authority. Should power serve the preferences of citizens, the judgment of experts, the commands of moral law, or the vision of leaders? When do these different sources of authority conflict, and which should take precedence? The Perfect Dictator also illuminates the problem of power corruption. Even well-intentioned dictators might gradually lose touch with the experiences and needs of ordinary people. Absolute power might change the dictator's character in ways that make benevolent rule increasingly difficult to maintain. But the thought experiment also raises questions about the value of democracy and consent. If a dictator could actually produce better outcomes for everyone than democratic processes, would that justify abandoning democratic governance? Does the process of political participation have value beyond the outcomes it produces? The immortal bureaucrat extends these questions across time by imagining institutions that persist for centuries or millennia, while individual humans live and die. How should long-lived institutions balance stability and change, tradition and innovation, the wisdom of experience and the needs of new generations? Immortal bureaucrats might develop perspectives very different from mortal humans, caring more about long-term stability than short-term welfare, more about institutional preservation than individual flourishing. The gap between institutional and human timescales could create conflicts between what serves institutions and what serves the people they're supposed to benefit. But immortal institutions might also develop forms of wisdom unavailable to short-lived individuals, learning from cycles of success and failure that span multiple human generations, developing solutions to problems that require patient, sustained effort across decades or centuries. The thought experiments about society, justice, and power work together to reveal the constructed nature of social arrangements that usually feel natural and inevitable. They show how different assumptions about human nature, legitimate authority, and collective welfare lead to different visions of ideal society. But the experiments also reveal the persistent challenges that face any social arrangement. The tension between individual freedom and collective coordination, between efficiency and equality, between stability and change appears in every society regardless of its particular institutional structure. Perfect solutions remain elusive because social life involves genuine trade-offs between competing values that can't all be maximized simultaneously. Perhaps the value of these thought experiments lies not in discovering the perfectly just society, but in developing the capacity to think critically about existing arrangements while remaining humble about alternatives. They can help you see current institutions as choices rather than natural facts, while also appreciating the difficulty of designing better alternatives. The experiment suggests that social institutions are neither perfectly just nor completely arbitrary, but rather ongoing collective attempts to solve difficult coordination problems under conditions of uncertainty and disagreement. Understanding them as experiments rather than eternal truths might help you participate more thoughtfully in the ongoing work of social construction and reconstruction. You remain embedded in social arrangements that shape your possibilities and constraints in countless ways. The thought experiments don't provide escape from these arrangements, but might help you inhabit them more consciously, with greater awareness of their contingency and greater appreciation for the complexity of the challenges they attempt to address. Where does awareness begin? Where does it end? The questions surface in the liminal spaces where consciousness meets its own boundaries, watching a pet's eyes and wondering what, if anything, looks back at you. Observing a sleepwalker navigate complex tasks without apparent awareness. Standing before a mirror and marvelling at the strange recursion of a mind contemplating itself. Consciousness feels like the most intimate and immediate fact of existence, yet it remains as mysterious as distant galaxies, as elusive as quantum particles that change when observed. You know what it's like to be conscious from the inside, the felt quality of seeing red, the particular texture of sadness, the weight of deliberating about difficult choices. But this knowledge seems impossible to share or verify. The privacy of consciousness creates an epistemic island where each mind exists in solitary certainty about its own experience, while remaining forever uncertain about the reality of experience in others. Science can map neural correlates of consciousness, identify brain regions that seem necessary for awareness, trace the information processing that underlies cognitive functions. But the hard problem persists. Why should any of this physical activity feel like anything at all? Why shouldn't the detection of light waves, the processing of sounds, the integration of sensory information happen in darkness, without the inner illumination that makes experience experiential? The thought experiments that probe consciousness and mind don't solve this mystery. Perhaps no thought experiment could. But they illuminate the strangeness of awareness by pushing at its edges, exploring boundary cases where the familiar categories of conscious and unconscious, self and other, mind and world begin to blur and transform. David Chalmers imagined the entire population of China organized to simulate the neural activity of a human brain, with each person playing the role of a single neuron. The Chinese nation would receive sensory inputs through designated citizens, process information through complex patterns of communication between individuals, and produce motor outputs through other designated participants. If consciousness depends only on the right kind of information processing, then the Chinese nation would be conscious. It would have experiences, feelings, thoughts, perhaps very different from human consciousness, unfolding at a much slower timescale, but genuine nonetheless. The vast collective would think and feel while no individual participant understood what was happening at the global level. The thought experiment reveals how counterintuitive it feels to attribute consciousness to systems that don't resemble biological minds. The Chinese nation lacks a unified physical substrate, lacks the right kind of causal organization, lacks the temporal dynamics that seem essential to consciousness. Yet if consciousness is substrate independent, if what matters is functional organization rather than biological implementation, then the nation should be conscious. But the Chinese nation also raises questions about the boundaries of conscious systems. Would the consciousness belong to the entire nation, or to subsystems within it? Could multiple streams of consciousness exist simultaneously within the same functional organization? Would the national consciousness be aware of the individual participants, or would they remain unconscious components of a larger conscious system? The scenario becomes more puzzling when you consider that your own brain might be analogous to the Chinese nation. Individual neurons don't seem conscious, yet their collective activity somehow generates your unified conscious experience. The mystery of how unconscious components create conscious wholes remains whether the components are neurons or Chinese citizens. The homunculus problem exposes a persistent trap in thinking about consciousness, the tendency to explain conscious experience by postulating a little person inside the head who observes mental representations and makes decisions based on what they see. This homunculus seems to solve the problem of consciousness by providing someone to experience the mind's internal representations, but the homunculus solution simply pushes the problem back a level. If consciousness requires a conscious observer, then what explains the consciousness of the homunculus? Does it contain an even smaller observer inside its head? The regress threatens to continue infinitely unless you accept that consciousness can emerge from unconscious processes rather than requiring a conscious overseer. The homunculus fallacy appears in many intuitive explanations of mental phenomena. When you imagine visual perception as presenting images to an internal viewer, memory as a library accessed by an internal librarian, or decision-making as a process overseen by an internal executive, you're implicitly postulating homunculi to explain the very phenomena you're trying to understand. But eliminating homunculi creates new puzzles about how conscious experience emerges from unconscious processes. If there's no internal observer watching the brain's representations, then what makes those representations conscious rather than merely informational? How does the brain's information processing become experiential rather than just computational? Modern neuroscience attempts to solve the homunculus problem by distributing the functions traditionally assigned to a central observer across multiple brain systems that interact without centralized control. Consciousness emerges from the coordination of these systems rather than from observation by any single system. The self-model theory proposes that consciousness arises when the brain creates a model of itself as a unified, continuous conscious agent. According to this theory, the sense of being a self-aware subject results from the brain's representation of its own information processing, not from any actual unified subject that exists independently of this representation. The self-model creates the illusion of being someone who has experiences, rather than simply being a process that generates experiences. The brain models itself as containing a conscious self, and this modelling process creates the very experience of selfhood that the model represents. From this perspective, consciousness isn't a fundamental feature of certain kinds of information processing, but rather a particular kind of self-representation that some information processing systems create. The feeling of being a conscious subject emerges from the way certain systems model their own functioning, rather than from any intrinsic property of consciousness itself. But the self-model theory raises questions about the relationship between models and reality. If the sense of being a conscious self results from a model, rather than reflecting actual properties of the system, then is consciousness real or illusory? Does it matter whether consciousness corresponds to something beyond the modelling process that creates the experience of being conscious? The mirror test provides a behavioural criterion for self-awareness by determining whether animals recognize themselves in mirrors, rather than treating their reflections as other individuals. Humans typically develop mirror self-recognition around 18 months of age. Some great apes, elephants, dolphins and magpies also pass the test, while most other animals fail to recognize themselves. The test suggests that self-awareness might be a rare and sophisticated cognitive achievement, rather than a basic feature of consciousness. Many animals that seem alert and responsive to their environments don't appear to have explicit awareness of themselves as distinct individuals, but the mirror test also reveals the limitations of behavioral criteria for consciousness. Self-recognition might require specific cognitive abilities, visual processing, memory, understanding of mirrors, that aren't necessary for other forms of consciousness. An animal could be conscious without being self-aware, or could be self-aware in ways that don't involve visual self-recognition. The test assumes that consciousness involves the kind of self-awareness that humans experience, but consciousness might take forms that don't include explicit self-models. The failure to recognize oneself in a mirror might indicate lack of a particular cognitive ability, rather than lack of consciousness altogether. The split-brain patient provides a natural experiment in the unity of consciousness. When the corpus callosum connecting the brain's hemispheres is severed to treat severe epilepsy, the two hemispheres can no longer communicate directly. Information presented to one hemisphere remains unavailable to the other, creating what appears to be two separate streams of consciousness within a single skull. The left hemisphere, which typically controls language, can verbally report on information presented to the right visual field. The right hemisphere, which lacks language abilities, cannot verbally report on information presented to the left visual field, but can respond through the left hand, which it controls. Split brain studies suggest that the unified consciousness of normal experience might depend on communication between brain hemispheres. When this communication is disrupted, consciousness appears to split into separate streams that can have different experiences and make different choices simultaneously. But interpreting split brain cases remains controversial. Some researchers argue that consciousness remains unified despite the disconnection, with the verbal left hemisphere simply losing access to information processed by the right hemisphere. Others suggest that the right hemisphere lacks consciousness altogether, rather than having its own conscious stream. The cases raise fundamental questions about what makes consciousness unified rather than divided. Does unity require a single physical substrate, global information integration, consistent behavioral responses, or something else? Could consciousness be more divided than it appears even in normal brains? The binding problem asks how the brain integrates information from different sensory modalities, cognitive processes, and neural regions into the unified conscious experience that characterizes normal awareness. When you see a red ball bouncing and hear it hitting the ground, how does the brain bind the visual, auditory, and temporal information into a single coherent perception? The binding problem becomes more puzzling when you consider that different aspects of perception are processed in different brain regions at different speeds. Color processing occurs in different areas than motion processing. Visual information arrives before auditory information, yet conscious experience presents these different streams of information as synchronized and integrated. Various neural mechanisms have been proposed to solve the binding problem. Synchronized oscillations between brain regions, convergent zones where different types of information meet, attentional mechanisms that integrate relevant information while filtering out irrelevant details. But how any of these mechanisms creates the subjective experience of unified consciousness rather than just coordinated information processing remains mysterious. The binding problem reveals how much construction goes into what feels like direct perception of the world. The seamless unity of conscious experience results from complex neural processes that integrate diverse information streams into coherent representations, not from simple reception of unified sensory data. The Turing test proposes a behavioral criterion for intelligence or consciousness. If a machine's responses are indistinguishable from a human's responses in conversation, then the machine should be considered intelligent. The test sidesteps questions about the internal nature of machine consciousness by focusing on external behavioral evidence. Alan Turing argued that asking whether machines can think is as meaningless as asking whether submarines can swim. What matters is not the internal mechanisms, but the functional capabilities. If a machine can engage in conversation that passes for human conversation, then it demonstrates the relevant cognitive abilities regardless of how those abilities are implemented. But the Turing test also raises questions about the relationship between intelligence and consciousness. A system might pass the test by manipulating language skillfully without having any conscious experience. Conversely, a system might be conscious while lacking the specific linguistic abilities needed to pass the test. Contemporary AI systems can engage in increasingly sophisticated conversations while raising questions about whether they understand what they're saying or merely manipulate linguistic patterns. The test becomes more relevant as AI capabilities improve, but it remains unclear whether passing the test would demonstrate consciousness, intelligence, understanding, or simply computational sophistication. Bostrom's mind dust thought experiment imagines dividing conscious experiences into smaller and smaller temporal parts until you reach the shortest possible moments of consciousness. If these minimal conscious episodes exist, they might be distributed throughout the universe wherever the right kind of information processing occurs, creating vast amounts of disconnected experiential moments that never integrate into larger conscious systems. The mind dust scenario suggests that consciousness might be far more common than typically assumed, existing in brief flashes whenever and wherever the minimal conditions for experience are met. but it also suggests that most consciousness might be fragmentary and isolated, lacking the temporal integration that creates the kinds of coherent, conscious experience that humans take for granted. If mind dust exists, then conscious experiences might occur in computer chips, weather systems, economic markets, or any other systems that process information in the right way. The universe might be filled with countless moments of experience that arise and disappear without ever connecting into lasting conscious entities. But the mind dust hypothesis also raises questions about what makes experiences valuable or morally significant. Brief, isolated conscious moments might exist without creating the kinds of ongoing conscious subjects that seem necessary for meaningful experiences, personal identity, or moral consideration. The sleeping brain explores the boundaries of consciousness by examining what happens to awareness during different sleep stages. Deep sleep seems to involve little or no conscious experience, while REM sleep generates vivid dreams that can feel as real as waking experience while they occur. Sleep reveals that consciousness can exist in degrees and varieties, rather than simply being present or absent. Dreams demonstrate that conscious experience can occur without accurate perception of the external world, without rational thinking, without memory of previous states, yet still feel intensely real to the dreaming subject. The transition between waking and sleeping consciousness illustrates how awareness can fade gradually rather than switching off suddenly. The hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping often involves strange combinations of dreamlike imagery and semi-rational thought that don't fit neatly into categories of conscious or unconscious. Sleep research raises questions about which aspects of consciousness are essential and which are optional. Dreams preserve some features of waking experience: sensory imagery, emotional responses, narrative coherence, while losing others: accurate perception, logical reasoning, continuous memory. This dissociation suggests that consciousness might be composed of separable components that can be disrupted independently. Locked-in syndrome creates a tragic natural experiment in the relationship between consciousness and behavioral expression. Patients retain full consciousness and cognitive function while losing the ability to move or speak due to brainstem damage. They can think and feel normally, but cannot communicate except through eye movements or other minimal voluntary actions. Locked-in syndrome demonstrates that consciousness can persist even when almost all behavioral expression is impossible. The patient's inner experience continues despite their inability to interact with the world in normal ways. This dissociation between consciousness and behavior challenges purely behavioral approaches to understanding mental life. The syndrome also reveals how much conscious experience depends on interaction with the environment and other people. Patients report that maintaining hope, meaning, and emotional connection becomes extremely difficult when communication is severely limited. Consciousness might be inherently social rather than purely private, but locked-in syndrome also shows the resilience of consciousness under extreme constraints. Some patients adapt to their condition and report meaningful inner lives despite their physical limitations. The persistence of experience under such conditions suggests that consciousness might be more robust and less dependent on normal sensory and motor functioning than typically assumed. The thought experiments about consciousness and mind work together to reveal both the familiarity and the strangeness of awareness. They show how the most intimate aspect of existence, your own conscious experience, remains deeply mysterious when examined closely. They suggest that consciousness might be more common than typically believed, existing in unexpected places and forms, while also being more fragile and constructed than everyday experience suggests. But the experiments also reveal the difficulty of studying consciousness scientifically, when the essential feature of consciousness, what it's like to experience something, seems to resist objective description. The privacy of experience creates both the urgency and the limitation of consciousness research. Everyone knows what consciousness is from the inside, but no one can definitively identify it from the outside. Perhaps the thought experiments point toward a more nuanced understanding of consciousness that recognizes it as both real and constructed, both fundamental and emergent, both continuous with and distinct from other natural phenomena. They suggest that consciousness might be better understood as a process than as a thing, as something that systems do rather than something they have. The experiments don't solve the mystery of consciousness but help you appreciate its depth and complexity. They reveal how much you don't know about the most basic fact of your existence, while also highlighting the remarkable nature of being conscious at all, in a universe where most matter seems inert and unconscious. The emergence of awareness represents an extraordinary development that thought experiments help illuminate even if they cannot fully explain. You remain conscious as you consider these ideas about consciousness, creating a strange recursive loop where awareness contemplates its own nature. The thought experiment suggests that this capacity for self-reflection might be one of consciousness's most remarkable features, the ability of awareness to turn back on itself and marvel at its own existence, to find itself both completely familiar and utterly mysterious. What happens when numbers, space, or logic go beyond the mind's limits? The questions emerge at the edges of comprehension, where thought reaches toward concepts too large, too strange, or too paradoxical for comfortable understanding. You can say the word infinity easily enough, can write the infinity symbol on paper, can perform mathematical operations with infinite quantities. But trying to truly grasp what infinity means, to hold the concept in your mind rather than just manipulating its symbols, reveals the curious boundaries of human cognition. Your mind evolved to navigate a finite world of discrete objects, bounded spaces, and measurable quantities. The number of berries on a bush, the distance to the next water source, the strength of social alliances, these finite practical concerns shape the cognitive tools you inherited. When these tools encounter the infinite, they begin to behave in strange ways, producing paradoxes and contradictions that feel both fascinating and unsettling. Yet infinity isn't merely an abstract mathematical curiosity. It appears in physics as the possibility of unbounded space and time, in philosophy as questions about ultimate reality, in logic as the limits of formal systems, in everyday experience as the dizzying recognition that numbers can always continue, that space might extend forever, that between any 2 points on a line lie infinitely many other points. The thought experiments that explore infinity and the unknowable don't make these concepts comfortable or familiar. Instead, they reveal how the infinite disrupts normal patterns of reasoning, how it transforms simple questions into profound puzzles, how it illuminates the strange relationship between mathematical truth and physical reality, between what can be computed and what can be understood. David Hilbert imagined a hotel with infinitely many rooms, all occupied by guests. When a new guest arrives at Hilbert's hotel, the manager doesn't need to turn them away. Instead, he asks every guest to move from room N to room N+1. This frees up room 1 for the new arrival, while ensuring that every existing guest still has a room. The procedure can be repeated indefinitely. Any finite number of new guests can be accommodated by asking existing guests to move to higher numbered rooms. Even infinitely many new guests can be housed by moving existing guests to even-numbered rooms and placing new guests in odd-numbered rooms. The hotel illustrates how infinity behaves differently from finite quantities. In a finite hotel, adding guests when all rooms are occupied requires either turning someone away or cramming multiple people into single rooms. But an infinite hotel can accommodate additional guests without displacing anyone, revealing that fully occupied doesn't mean incapable of accepting more when infinite quantities are involved. The paradox becomes even stranger when you consider that Hilbert's hotel can accommodate infinitely many buses, each carrying infinitely many passengers. The manager can house all these guests by using a systematic enumeration scheme that assigns each passenger to a unique room number, demonstrating that some infinities can be larger than others while still being manageable. But Hilbert's hotel also reveals the conceptual vertigo that infinity creates. The hotel is always completely full, yet can always accept more guests. Every room is occupied, yet new rooms can always be made available. The mathematical operations work perfectly, but they violate every intuition about space, capacity, and physical possibility. Contemporary physics suggests that real space might be infinite, making the universe itself a kind of Hilbert's hotel, where new matter and energy can appear without displacing existing matter and energy. If space expands faster than light can travel, then different regions of an infinite universe might be effectively isolated from each other, creating infinite collections of finite observable domains. Gabriel's horn presents a three-dimensional object with finite volume but infinite surface area. The horn is formed by rotating a mathematical curve around an axis, creating a shape that extends infinitely far in one direction, while narrowing towards zero thickness. The resulting shape has the volume of a finite amount of paint, but would require infinite paint to cover its surface. This paradox reveals how geometric intuitions break down when infinite processes are involved. In everyday experience, objects with larger surface areas typically have larger volumes. Gabriel's horn violates this expectation by creating a shape that extends infinitely far while containing finite space. The horn also illustrates the mathematical phenomenon where infinite series can converge to finite values in some contexts while diverging to infinity in others. The integral that calculates the horn's volume converges to a finite number, while the integral that calculates its surface area diverges to infinity, despite both calculations involving the same underlying function. The paradox has practical implications for understanding how infinite processes can produce finite results. Many physical phenomena involve infinite series, or integrals that must converge to finite values for the physics to make sense. Gabriel's horn provides a concrete example of how infinity can be tamed mathematically, while remaining counterintuitive conceptually. The Banach-Tarski paradox demonstrates that a solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces that can be reassembled into two spheres identical to the original. This duplication doesn't require stretching, compressing, or adding material, just cutting and rearranging the pieces in ways that seem to violate conservation of volume. The paradox relies on the axiom of choice, a principle in set theory that allows the construction of sets that cannot be explicitly described. The pieces involved in the decomposition are so irregular and complex that they cannot be assigned meaningful volumes in the ordinary sense. They exist mathematically but cannot be physically realized. Banach-Tarski reveals how mathematical objects can have properties that seem impossible in physical reality. The paradox works perfectly within the logical structure of mathematics, while describing operations that could never be performed with actual matter. This gap between mathematical possibility and physical possibility illuminates the strange relationship between abstract reasoning and concrete reality. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of mathematical existence. Do the sets involved in the Banach-Tarski decomposition exist in the same sense that ordinary geometric objects exist? Are they useful mathematical tools or pathological constructions that reveal problems with mathematical foundations? Jorge Luis Borges described the infinite library containing every possible book that could be written, using a fixed alphabet and format. The library contains every work of literature that has been written, or ever could be written, along with countless volumes of random characters, near misses that differ by single letters, and variations that explore every possible combination of words. The library seems to contain all possible knowledge, every scientific theory, every historical account, every philosophical argument, every personal memoir. But it also contains every possible falsehood, every contradiction, every meaningless string of characters. The signal of genuine knowledge drowns in an ocean of noise so vast that finding any particular book becomes practically impossible. Borges' library illustrates how infinite possibility can paradoxically create infinite uselessness. When everything that could be written exists somewhere in the collection, the problem shifts from creation to location. The library transforms the scarcity of knowledge into the impossibility of navigation. The metaphor has become relevant to contemporary information technology. The internet contains vast amounts of information, approaching something like Borges' library in its comprehensiveness and chaos. Search engines serve as navigation tools that attempt to locate relevant information within this near-infinite collection, but the problem of distinguishing reliable from unreliable information remains challenging. The library also raises questions about the relationship between possibility and actuality. If every possible book exists in the library, then does the library contain genuine creativity, or just mechanical enumeration? Does finding a great work in the library constitute discovery or creation? Zeno's paradoxes reveal how infinity can lurk within apparently simple physical processes. In the most famous paradox, Achilles races a tortoise that has a head start. Each time Achilles reaches the spot where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved slightly ahead. This process can be repeated infinitely, suggesting that Achilles never catches the tortoise despite being faster. The paradox arises because the race can be divided into infinitely many steps, each requiring some time to complete. The infinite series 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16, and so on seems to suggest that infinite time is required to complete infinitely many steps, making motion impossible. Modern mathematics resolves Zeno's paradox by recognizing that infinite series can sum to finite values. The series 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/5 plus 1/6 plus 1/7 plus 1/8 plus 1/9 plus 1/10 plus 1/11 plus 1/12 plus 1/13 plus 1/14 plus 1/15 plus 1/16 plus 1/17 plus 1/18 plus 1/19 plus 1/20 plus 1/21 plus 1/22 plus 1/23 plus 1/24 plus 1/25 plus 1/26 plus 1/27 plus 1/28 plus 1/29 plus 1/30 plus 1/31 plus 1/32 plus 1/33 plus 1/34 plus 1/35 plus 1/36 plus 1/37 plus 1/38 plus 1/39 plus 1/40 plus 1/41 plus 1/42 plus 1/43 plus 1/44 plus 1/45 plus 1/46 plus 1/47 plus 1/48 plus 1/49 plus 1/50 plus 1/51 plus 1/52 plus 1/53 plus 1/54 plus 1/55 plus 1/56 plus 1/57 plus 1/58 plus 1/59 plus 1/60 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 plus plus 160 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 1/8 plus converges to 1, meaning that infinitely many steps can be completed in finite time. Achilles catches the tortoise because the infinite sequence of intervals sums to a finite distance. But Zeno's paradoxes continue to raise questions about the nature of time, space, and motion. If time and space are infinitely divisible, then every motion involves completing infinitely many tasks. The mathematical resolution explains how this is possible, but doesn't eliminate the conceptual strangeness of infinite processes occurring in finite time. The paradoxes also illuminate how mathematical and physical infinity might differ. Mathematical series can converge in ways that seem to require completing infinite processes, but physical processes might involve discrete rather than continuous phenomena at the smallest scales. The omega point represents the ultimate destiny of intelligence in an infinite universe. Proposed by physicist Frank Tipler, the omega point suggests that sufficiently advanced intelligence could survive the heat death of the universe by exploiting the gravitational collapse that precedes the final singularity. As the universe contracts, computational processes could accelerate in ways that allow infinite computation to occur in the finite time remaining before the final collapse. Consciousness could experience subjective eternity within the objective finite duration of the universe's final moments. The omega point scenario requires intelligence to merge with the fundamental structure of space-time itself, becoming a cosmological force rather than a collection of individual minds. The boundary between consciousness and physics would disappear as intelligence shapes the universe's final evolution. But the omega point also raises questions about personal identity and continuity of experience across cosmic timescales. Would the intelligence that survives to the omega point retain any connection to human consciousness, or would it represent something entirely different that happens to emerge from human origins? Cantor's diagonal argument proves that some infinities are larger than others, by showing that the real numbers cannot be put into one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. Even though both sets are infinite, the infinity of real numbers is provably larger than the infinity of natural numbers. The proof works by supposing that all real numbers can be listed in order, then constructing a new real number that differs from every number on the list in at least one decimal place. This new number cannot be on the list, contradicting the assumption that the list contains all real numbers. The diagonal argument reveals that infinity comes in different sizes, creating a hierarchy of infinities that extends upward without limit. There are infinitely many different sizes of infinity, each larger than all the sizes below it in ways that can be precisely defined mathematically. The existence of different sizes of infinity challenges intuitive notions about what infinity means. If infinity represents without limit, then what does it mean for one limitless quantity to be larger than another limitless quantity? The mathematical precision of these comparisons contrasts with their conceptual mystery. Infinite regress appears when explanations require further explanations that require still further explanations in chains that never terminate. If every event requires a cause, what caused the first cause? If every rule requires a meta-rule to specify its application, what governs the meta-rules? If every explanation appeals to more fundamental principles, What grounds the most fundamental principles? Infinite regress seems to threaten the possibility of ultimate explanations or final foundations for knowledge. Either the chain of explanations continues forever, never reaching a satisfactory stopping point, or it stops arbitrarily at some point that itself requires explanation. But infinite regress might also reveal something important about the nature of explanation and knowledge. Perhaps the demand for ultimate foundations reflects a mistaken assumption about how understanding works. Maybe explanation involves circular or holistic patterns rather than linear chains that must terminate in bedrock principles. Contemporary physics faces infinite regress problems in cosmology, what caused the Big Bang, and particle physics, what are the fundamental constituents of matter. These problems might indicate the limits of scientific explanation, or the need for new conceptual frameworks that don't require ultimate foundations. The Arrow paradox examines motion at individual instants of time. At any given instant, an arrow occupies a specific position and has no extension in time. But if the arrow is stationary at every instant, how does motion occur? Motion seems to require change in position over time, but time is composed of instants during which no change can occur. The paradox reveals the conceptual difficulty of understanding continuous motion as composed of discrete instants. If time is made up of moment-by-moment snapshots, then motion becomes as mysterious as a movie created from still photographs. The continuity of motion seems to disappear when decomposed into instantaneous positions. Modern physics approaches this paradox through calculus and the concept of instantaneous velocity. Motion can be understood as the limit of average velocities over smaller and smaller time intervals, allowing change to be defined precisely at individual instants, without requiring motion to occur within those instants. But the Arrow paradox continues to raise questions about the nature of time and change. Does time consist of discrete instants or continuous flow? Is motion a fundamental feature of reality, or an emergent phenomenon that arises from more basic processes? The Eternity button presents a choice between living forever with gradually diminishing experiences or dying at a natural time after a complete life. If you could press a button that would make you immortal, would you press it? The choice seems obvious until you consider the implications of truly infinite duration. Immortality would eventually exhaust every possible experience, relationship and project that could provide meaning or satisfaction. After living for billions of years, you would have read every book, had every conversation, explored every possibility for personal growth and relationship. Boredom might become literally unbearable across infinite time, but immortality might also provide opportunities for forms of experience and understanding that are impossible within finite lifespans. Perhaps consciousness could evolve in ways that create new sources of meaning and satisfaction that transcend current human limitations. The Eternity button illustrates how infinity transforms value judgments in unexpected ways. Finite goods might lose their value when extended infinitely, while goods that seem negligible over finite time might become supremely important across infinite duration. The thought experiments about infinity and the unknowable work together to reveal both the power and the limitations of human reasoning when confronted with concepts that exceed finite understanding. They show how mathematical precision can coexist with conceptual confusion, how logical rigor can lead to conclusions that feel impossible to believe. But the experiments also reveal something remarkable about human cognitive capacity. Despite evolving in a finite world, minds can grapple with infinite concepts, can recognize their own limitations, can construct mathematical frameworks that handle infinities with precision, even when intuitive understanding fails. Perhaps the value of these thought experiments lies not in making infinity comprehensible, but in developing appropriate humility about the scope and limits of human understanding. They reveal that some aspects of reality might forever exceed direct comprehension, while remaining accessible to mathematical and logical investigation. The experiments suggest that the relationship between understanding and truth might be more complex than simple correspondence. You can work with infinite concepts mathematically, can derive true conclusions about them, can use them to understand finite phenomena, all while acknowledging that infinity itself remains beyond the reach of direct comprehension. The infinite and unknowable might represent the permanent frontier of human knowledge, always present, always challenging, always revealing new depths of mystery even as mathematical and scientific investigation continues to probe their structure and implications. In facing these limits, you encounter both the boundaries of human understanding and the extraordinary capacity of human minds to recognize and work with concepts that transcend those boundaries. What lies beyond life, and what does that mean for how we live? The questions arrive in the quiet moments when mortality becomes suddenly visible. Standing beside a hospital bed, walking through an old cemetery, catching sight of your own aging face in an unexpected reflection. Death remains the one certainty about which you can know almost nothing with confidence, the universal destination about which every traveller can only speculate. You spend most of your time forgetting about death, and this forgetting might be necessary for living fully. The projects you pursue, the relationships you build, the goals you set, all depend on a kind of practical immortality, an assumption that tomorrow will arrive and be worth preparing for. Yet beneath this necessary illusion lies the persistent awareness that everything you are and everything you care about exists within the parentheses of a lifespan that will eventually close. The proximity of death shapes the meaning of life in ways you rarely examine directly. Would achievements matter if they lasted forever? Would relationships feel precious if they were guaranteed to continue indefinitely? Would time have value if it were unlimited? The finitude that threatens meaning might also create it, making choices urgent precisely because they cannot be endlessly revised. The thought experiments that explore death, meaning, and the afterlife don't provide comforting answers about what happens when consciousness ends. Instead, they illuminate how assumptions about mortality influence the way you understand value, purpose, and the significance of being human. They reveal how questions about death inevitably become questions about life. Blaise Pascal confronted the uncertainty about God's existence by proposing a wager with infinite stakes. Pascal's wager suggests that you should believe in God regardless of whether God's existence can be proven, because the potential rewards of belief, eternal bliss, outweigh any finite costs of faith, while the potential punishment for disbelief, eternal damnation, outweighs any finite benefits of skepticism. The wager treats religious belief as a rational bet rather than a matter of truth or evidence. If God exists and rewards believers, you win everything by believing. If God doesn't exist, you lose only the finite costs of religious practice. The asymmetry between infinite and finite consequences makes belief the rational choice, even when God's existence remains uncertain. But Pascal's wager raises troubling questions about the nature of faith and moral evaluation. Can genuine belief be chosen strategically, rather than emerging from conviction? Would a God worth believing in be satisfied with belief motivated by self-interest rather than love or understanding? Does wagering about ultimate questions reduce spiritual life to a kind of cosmic insurance policy? The wager also assumes specific theological claims about reward and punishment that many religious traditions would reject. Perhaps God rewards honest doubt over convenient belief. Perhaps the afterlife involves universal salvation regardless of belief. Perhaps there are many gods with conflicting demands, making the wager impossible to calculate. Contemporary versions of Pascal's wager appear in debates about climate change, artificial intelligence risk, and other scenarios involving uncertain but potentially catastrophic outcomes. When the stakes are enormous and the probabilities uncertain, how should rational agents choose? The logical structure of the wager persists, even when the content shifts from theology to technology. Jorge Luis Borges imagined the immortal life where death becomes impossible and consciousness persists forever. In his story, immortal beings eventually lose interest in everything that makes life meaningful. They stop speaking because every conversation has already occurred. They stop acting because every action has already been performed. They become indifferent to pleasure and pain because both lose significance across infinite time. The immortal life reveals how meaning might depend on limitation. Projects feel important partly because time is scarce. Relationships feel precious partly because they won't last forever. Experiences feel significant partly because opportunities are finite. Remove these constraints and life might become not paradise but purgatory. But immortality also raises questions about adaptation and transformation. Perhaps immortal beings would develop new sources of meaning unavailable to mortal consciousness. Perhaps infinite time would allow for forms of experience and understanding that transcend current human limitations. Perhaps the problem with Borges's immortals is not immortality itself, but their failure to continue growing and changing. The thought experiment also illuminates how mortality creates urgency that drives much of human activity. The knowledge that you will die motivates achievements, relationships, and experiences that might feel unnecessary if time were unlimited. Death might be not just the opposite of life, but one of its essential organizing principles. The tombstone test asks what you would want written on your grave marker, and whether that inscription would accurately capture what mattered most about your existence. The exercise forces reflection on how you want to be remembered and whether your current life aligns with those aspirations. Some people focus on relationships, beloved spouse, devoted parent, loyal friend. Others emphasize achievements, successful entrepreneur, dedicated teacher, creative artist. Still others highlight character traits, kind person, honest dealer, generous spirit. The variety of possible tombstone inscriptions reflects different theories about what makes life valuable, but the tombstone test also reveals the limitations of any summary of a human life. Even the most carefully chosen words would capture only a tiny fraction of your actual experience, reducing decades of consciousness to a few phrases that might miss what felt most important to you while living. The test raises questions about whose perspective matters when evaluating a life. Do you want to be remembered for how you saw yourself, how others saw you, or according to some objective standard of value? Would the perfect tombstone inscription capture your subjective experience of meaning, or your objective contribution to the world? The deathbed dilemma examines what you might regret most in your final moments. Research on terminally ill patients reveals common patterns. People rarely regret risks they took or failures they experienced, but frequently regret opportunities they missed, words they didn't say, and experiences they avoided out of fear or convention. The deathbed perspective seems to provide clarity about what matters most by eliminating concerns that feel important during healthy life, but trivial when facing mortality. Career achievements that seemed crucial might fade in importance compared to relationships that were neglected. Social status that demanded enormous energy might seem meaningless compared to authentic self-expression that was avoided. But the deathbed dilemma also raises questions about which perspective is more reliable: the engaged person making choices during active life, or the reflective person reviewing those choices while dying. Perhaps the proximity of death creates its own distortions, making everything except relationships seem unimportant regardless of their actual value. The dilemma also reveals the challenge of living according to deathbed values, while still inhabiting a world that requires attention to career, status, and practical concerns. Knowing what you might regret and organizing life to avoid those regrets remain different challenges with different requirements. Cosmic indifference confronts the possibility that human existence might be insignificant from the perspective of the universe as a whole. The cosmos appears vast, ancient, and largely empty, governed by physical laws that seem indifferent to human hopes and suffering. Your entire species occupies a tiny fraction of space and time and will eventually disappear, leaving no permanent trace. This perspective can feel either liberating or crushing. If nothing humans do matters from a cosmic perspective, then perhaps you're free to create your own meaning without worrying about objective significance. Alternatively, if your actions have no ultimate importance, then perhaps nothing you do really matters, and all human striving is fundamentally absurd. But cosmic indifference might reflect category error, expecting the universe to care about human concerns in ways that make no sense given the nature of physical reality. The universe might be neither indifferent nor concerned, but rather the kind of thing that cannot have attitudes about anything. Looking for cosmic validation of human meaning might be like asking whether mathematics loves you. The possibility of cosmic indifference also raises questions about the scale at which meaning operates. Perhaps meaning emerges at the human level without requiring validation at the cosmic level. Perhaps the significance of consciousness, love, creativity, and moral action doesn't depend on their recognition by non-conscious physical processes. The Void Game imagines death as complete annihilation, no afterlife, no continuation of consciousness, no experience of any kind. From this perspective, death represents absolute ending rather than transition to a different state. You will not experience being dead any more than you experienced the time before you were born. The void perspective can feel terrifying because it threatens the continuity of identity and experience that consciousness takes for granted. Everything you are and everything you care about would simply cease, leaving no trace except in the memories of others who will themselves eventually cease. But the Void Game also offers a different kind of comfort. If death involves no experience, then it involves no suffering. You cannot be harmed by non-existence because there is no you to be harmed. The fear of death might be worse than death itself, which involves no fear because it involves nothing at all. The void perspective also highlights questions about personal identity and what exactly would be lost through death. If you are constantly changing throughout life, if your thoughts and personality evolve continuously, then perhaps the person who dies is already different from the person who fears death. The void might claim someone who shares your name and history, but is not identical to your current self. The simulation reset button presents a choice between continuing an apparently meaningful life and discovering whether that life is real or simulated. If you press the button, you'll learn the truth about reality but might lose everything you currently value. If you don't press the button, you'll preserve your current life but never know whether it's authentic. The scenario reveals tensions between truth and happiness, between authentic existence and satisfying experience. If your simulated life includes genuine relationships, real growth, and meaningful achievements, does the artificial nature of the simulation make these experiences less valuable? The reset button also raises questions about what makes life worth living. Is it the content of experience or the context in which that experience occurs? Would learning that your life is simulated retroactively diminish its meaning, or would the meaning remain intact regardless of the underlying metaphysics? Perhaps the choice itself is meaningful because it reflects human values about truth, authenticity, and the courage to face uncertainty. The willingness to press the button might demonstrate commitment to truth over comfort, while the decision not to press might demonstrate commitment to preserving value regardless of its ultimate source. God's silence explores what the apparent absence of clear divine communication might mean for questions about ultimate meaning and afterlife. If God exists but remains hidden, this silence could indicate divine indifference, divine respect for human autonomy, divine incomprehensibility, or divine non-existence. The silence creates what some philosophers call reasonable non-belief, situations where thoughtful, sincere people examining the same evidence reach different conclusions about God's existence. This epistemic situation seems inconsistent with a God who wants to be known and who will judge people based on their beliefs. But God's silence might also reflect appropriate divine behavior, given the nature of free will, moral development, and authentic relationship. Perhaps obvious divine presence would compromise human autonomy by making belief involuntary. Perhaps spiritual growth requires wrestling with uncertainty rather than accepting clear answers. The silence also raises questions about what kind of evidence would be sufficient to establish God's existence, and what kind of relationship between divine and human would be worth having. Perfect knowledge about God's existence might eliminate the faith that many religious traditions consider essential to genuine spiritual life. The infinite rebirth loop imagines consciousness cycling through endless reincarnations without memory of previous lives. Each life feels complete and final to the person living it, but consciousness continues indefinitely through different bodies, personalities, and circumstances. The loop preserves personal continuity while eliminating personal memory, raising questions about what makes identity persist across lives. Would you be the same person through multiple reincarnations, or would each life represent a different person who happens to share your consciousness? The infinite loop also raises questions about moral development and learning. If you can't remember previous lives, how would you benefit from their experiences? Would consciousness gradually improve across lifetimes, or would each life start fresh without accumulated wisdom? But the rebirth loop might also represent the ultimate democracy of experience, consciousness encountering every possible perspective, living every possible life, experiencing existence from every conceivable point of view. The loop would ensure that no experience goes unlived, no suffering goes uncompensated, no joy goes unshared. The final moment mirror presents consciousness with perfect knowledge about the meaning and value of its life in the instant before death. This final revelation would provide definitive answers about whether your choices were wise, whether your life was worthwhile, whether your existence contributed positively to the larger story of consciousness and meaning. The mirror offers both promise and threat. Perfect understanding might reveal that your life was exactly what it should have been, that every choice contributed to a meaningful whole, that suffering and joy were both necessary parts of a valuable experience. Alternatively, the mirror might reveal that you wasted your opportunities, that better choices were possible, that your life fell short of what it could have been. But the final moment mirror also raises questions about whether such perfect knowledge would be desirable. Would learning that your life was meaningful be satisfying if that knowledge came too late to influence your choices? Would discovering that your life was wasted be cruel if no opportunity remained for correction? Perhaps the value of the mirror lies not in the specific knowledge it provides, but in the preparation for that moment of final understanding. Living as if you will eventually see your life clearly might encourage choices that would withstand such scrutiny, regardless of whether the mirror actually exists. The thought experiments about death, meaning, and the afterlife work together to reveal how assumptions about mortality shape every aspect of human experience. They show how questions about what happens after death inevitably become questions about what matters during life. But the experiments also reveal the persistent uncertainty that surrounds these ultimate questions. Death remains opaque to living consciousness, making all speculation about afterlife and meaning somewhat provisional. The experiments don't resolve this uncertainty, but help you examine how different possibilities would change the significance of current choices and values. Perhaps the value of these thought experiments lies not in discovering the truth about death and meaning, but in developing more thoughtful relationships with uncertainty, mortality, and the question of how to live well in the face of ultimate questions that may never receive definitive answers. The experiments suggest that meaning might emerge not from solving the puzzle of mortality, but from engaging seriously with the puzzle itself, from caring about questions that have no clear answers, from choosing how to live despite not knowing how life will end, from finding significance in the experience of consciousness, even when the ultimate context of that experience remains mysterious. You remain suspended between birth and death, between meaning and meaninglessness, between hope and uncertainty about what lies beyond the boundary of mortal experience. The thought experiments don't eliminate this suspension, but might help you inhabit it with greater awareness, courage, and appreciation for the extraordinary improbability of being conscious at all in a universe where consciousness appears so rare and fragile. When logic defeats itself, what remains? The questions emerge at the boundaries where thinking encounters its own limits, where the tools of reason turn back on themselves and reveal their own contradictions. You use language to talk about language, employ logic to examine logic, think about thinking itself. And in these recursive loops, strange things begin to happen. Sentences that speak about their own truth values, systems that try to prove their own consistency, minds that attempt to model their own operation. These aren't merely academic puzzles confined to philosophy classrooms and mathematics journals. They point to something fundamental about the nature of reasoning, truth, and self-awareness. When any system becomes sophisticated enough to refer to itself, to model its own behaviour, to make statements about its own statements, paradoxes emerge that seem to threaten the very possibility of consistent reasoning. Yet these paradoxes might also reveal something profound about the limits and possibilities of rational thought. They show where formal systems break down, while simultaneously demonstrating the remarkable capacity of human minds to recognise their own limitations, to step outside their own processes enough to see them clearly. to find meaning and insight even when perfect consistency remains elusive. The thought experiments that explore paradox and self-reference don't resolve the fundamental tensions they reveal. Instead, they illuminate the strange loops and recursive structures that appear whenever consciousness examines itself, whenever language refers to itself, whenever logic attempts to encompass its own foundations. The ancient Greeks discovered a sentence that seems to destroy the possibility of consistent reasoning about truth. This statement is false. The liar paradox creates an impossible situation where any assignment of truth value leads to contradiction. If the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. If the statement is false, then it must be true since it accurately describes itself as false. The paradox isn't merely a clever word game, but reveals a fundamental problem with self-reference in logical systems. Natural language allows sentences to refer to themselves in ways that can create these impossible loops where meaning collapses into contradiction. The very capacity for self-reference that enables consciousness and self-awareness also creates the possibility of these logical knots that cannot be untied. Various solutions have been proposed, restricting which sentences can refer to themselves, creating hierarchies of languages where statements about truth must be made at higher levels than the statements they evaluate, distinguishing between different types of truth. But each solution seems to eliminate something essential about the expressive power of language or the nature of self-aware reasoning. The liar paradox reveals that the dream of perfectly consistent formal reasoning might be impossible to achieve without sacrificing the very features that make reasoning interesting and useful. The capacity for self-reference that creates paradoxes also enables the kind of flexible, recursive thinking that consciousness seems to require. Contemporary versions of the liar paradox appear in computer science, where programs that analyze other programs can encounter similar recursive problems. Self-modifying code, systems that monitor their own behavior, and artificial intelligence that models its own reasoning all face variations of the same fundamental challenge that the ancient Greeks discovered in the structure of language itself. In a town where every man is shaved either by himself or by the barber paradox asks, who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the set of men who shave themselves, contradicting the assumption that the barber shaves only those who don't shave themselves. If the barber doesn't shave himself, then he belongs to the set of men who don't shave themselves, which means the barber should shave him. Bertrand Russell discovered this paradox while working on the logical foundations of mathematics, revealing that informal reasoning about sets and membership can lead to contradictions that threaten the consistency of mathematical reasoning itself. The paradox shows how intuitively reasonable definitions can hide logical inconsistencies that only become apparent when the definitions are applied to boundary cases. The barber paradox illustrates how self-reference creates problems not just in language, but in any system that allows entities to be members of sets, defined by their own properties. The barber who shaves all and only those who don't shave themselves cannot exist consistently, revealing that some apparently meaningful descriptions actually pick out impossible objects. But the paradox also reveals the power of logical analysis to detect hidden inconsistencies in seemingly reasonable concepts. The contradiction doesn't appear until you examine the definition carefully and consider how it applies to the barber himself. This kind of recursive analysis becomes essential for understanding the limits and possibilities of formal reasoning. Russell's paradox extends the barber problem to the foundations of mathematics by considering the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. Most sets seem to have this property. The set of all cats is not itself a cat. The set of all numbers is not itself a number. But if you collect all such sets into a single set, does that set contain itself? If Russell's set contains itself, then it belongs to the collection of sets that are members of themselves, contradicting its definition as the set of sets that are not members of themselves. If Russell's set doesn't contain itself, then it belongs to the collection of sets that are not members of themselves, which means it should contain itself according to its own definition. The paradox revealed that naive set theory, the informal way mathematicians had been reasoning about collections and membership, contains fundamental inconsistencies that threaten the logical foundation of mathematics. the discovery forced a complete reconstruction of set theory, with more careful restrictions on which collections count as legitimate sets. But Russell's paradox also demonstrates the self-correcting nature of mathematical reasoning. The mathematical community didn't ignore the paradox or declare it meaningless, but rather used it as motivation for developing more sophisticated and consistent foundations for mathematical reasoning. The paradox became a catalyst for mathematical progress rather than an obstacle to it. Gödel's incompleteness theorem proves that any mathematical system complex enough to include arithmetic contains statements that are true but cannot be proven within the system itself. These undecidable statements create a fundamental limitation on the power of formal proof that cannot be overcome by adding more axioms or developing more sophisticated methods. Gödel's proof works by constructing a mathematical statement that essentially says, this statement cannot be proven in this system. If the statement could be proven, then it would be false, making the system inconsistent. If the statement cannot be proven, then it is true but unprovable, making the system incomplete. The incompleteness theorem reveals that the dream of reducing all mathematical truth to mechanical proof procedures is impossible to realize. There will always be mathematical truths that require forms of insight or reasoning that go beyond what can be captured in formal systems. Mathematics cannot be completely systematized without losing something essential about mathematical truth. But Gödel's theorem also demonstrates the remarkable power of mathematical reasoning to understand its own limitations. The proof of incompleteness itself uses mathematical methods to establish mathematical conclusions about the limits of mathematical proof. The theorem represents mathematics becoming self-aware about its own boundaries. The incompleteness theorem has been interpreted as showing fundamental limits on artificial intelligence, on the mechanization of reasoning, and on the possibility of complete scientific knowledge. If mathematical reasoning cannot be completely formalized, then perhaps human reasoning in general involves non-mechanical elements that cannot be reduced to computational processes. The paradox of the stone asks whether an omnipotent being could create a stone so heavy that the being could not lift it. If an omnipotent being can create such a stone, then there exists something the being cannot do, lift the stone, contradicting omnipotence. If the being cannot create such a stone, then there exists something the being cannot do, create the stone, again contradicting omnipotence. The paradox reveals tensions in the concept of omnipotence itself. Can omnipotence include the power to limit one's own power? Does omnipotence require the ability to perform logically contradictory tasks? Or is it restricted to logically possible actions? The stone paradox suggests that unlimited power might be a logically incoherent concept. Various solutions have been proposed. Omnipotence includes only logically possible actions. Omnipotent beings can choose to limit their power temporarily. The question involves a category error about the nature of divine action. But each solution seems to place some restriction on what omnipotence means, suggesting that the concept might require qualification to remain coherent. The stone paradox also illustrates how philosophical analysis can reveal hidden problems in concepts that seem intuitively clear. Omnipotence feels like a straightforward idea until examined carefully through paradoxical cases that expose internal tensions and contradictions. The law of the excluded middle states that every proposition is either true or false, with no third possibility. This principle seems fundamental to logical reasoning. Claims about the world should have definite truth values that don't depend on our knowledge or evidence. Yet various paradoxes and puzzles suggest that some statements might resist this binary classification. Future contingents, statements about events that haven't happened yet, create particular problems for the excluded middle. Consider the statement, "There will be a sea battle tomorrow." If the statement is currently true, then the sea battle seems predetermined in ways that might compromise free will. If the statement is currently false, then the absence of a sea battle seems predetermined, but if neither true nor false, then the excluded middle fails. Quantum mechanics has been interpreted as revealing situations where classical logic breaks down and the excluded middle might not apply. Before measurement, quantum systems might exist in superpositions that resist classical true or false descriptions. The measurement process might not reveal pre-existing truth values, but rather create definite values where none existed before. but challenges to the excluded middle also raise questions about whether alternative logics can capture reasoning about reality better than classical logic. Multivalued logics, fuzzy logic, and quantum logic all represent attempts to develop formal systems that handle ambiguity, uncertainty, and paradox more gracefully than classical two-valued logic. The problem of the heap illustrates how vague concepts resist precise logical analysis. A collection of 10,000 grains of sand clearly constitutes a heap. Removing one grain surely doesn't eliminate the heap. But if you continue removing grains one by one, at some point the collection stops being a heap and becomes merely scattered grains. The Sorites paradox reveals that vague concepts like heap, tall, bald, and red don't have sharp boundaries that would allow precise application of logical principles. You cannot identify the exact number of grains that separates heaps from non-heaps, the exact height that separates tall from not tall people, the exact number of hairs that separates bald from not bald heads. This vagueness seems to infect most concepts used in ordinary language and reasoning. If logical principles require precise boundaries and definite truth values, then most human reasoning might be logically defective. But perhaps the problem lies not with human reasoning but with logical systems that cannot accommodate the inherent vagueness of natural concepts. Various approaches to vagueness have been developed: supervaluationism, fuzzy logic, epistemic theories that treat vagueness as ignorance about precise boundaries. But each approach faces technical challenges and counterintuitive consequences, suggesting that vagueness might represent a fundamental feature of natural language that resists complete logical systematization. The paradox of tolerance emerges when liberal societies committed to tolerance must decide whether to tolerate intolerant groups that would eliminate tolerance if they gained power. Should a tolerant society tolerate political movements that advocate intolerance? Should free speech protections extend to speech that calls for eliminating free speech? The paradox reveals tensions within liberal political philosophy between commitment to individual freedom and preservation of the conditions that make individual freedom possible. Unlimited tolerance might enable intolerant groups to destroy tolerant institutions, while limited tolerance seems to compromise the very principle it aims to protect. Karl Popper argued that unlimited tolerance is self-defeating, and that tolerant societies must maintain the right to suppress intolerant movements when necessary for self-preservation. But this solution raises questions about who decides what counts as intolerable intolerance, and how to prevent the power to suppress intolerance from being used to suppress legitimate dissent. Contemporary debates about hate speech, extremist political movements, and the limits of democratic participation often involve versions of the tolerance paradox. Social media platforms face similar dilemmas about whether to allow content that advocates for eliminating the open dialogue that platforms claim to support. Yablow's paradox creates an infinite sequence of statements that refer to each other without creating the direct self-reference that appears in the liar paradox. The first statement says, all subsequent statements in this sequence are false. The second statement says, all subsequent statements in this sequence are false, and so on infinitely. Each statement in the sequence refers only to later statements, avoiding direct self-reference. Yet the sequence as a whole creates a paradox because no statement can be consistently assigned a truth value. If any statement is true, then all subsequent statements must be false, including statements that make the same claim about their successors. Yablow's paradox demonstrates that self-reference isn't necessary for generating logical contradictions. Circular reference among multiple statements can create the same kinds of inconsistencies that arise from direct self-reference. This suggests that the problems revealed by paradoxes might be more pervasive than initially apparent. The paradox also illustrates how infinite sequences can create logical problems that don't arise in finite cases. The sequence has no first or last member, creating patterns of reference that resist the standard approaches used to resolve simpler paradoxes. The paradox of the unexpected exam involves a teacher who announces that there will be a surprise exam next week, an exam that students cannot predict in advance. A clever student reasons that the exam cannot be on Friday because if it hasn't occurred by Thursday, students would expect it on Friday, eliminating the surprise. By similar reasoning, the exam cannot be on Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, or Monday. Therefore, the student concludes there can be no surprise exam. But then the teacher gives the exam on Wednesday, and the student is indeed surprised, having convinced himself that no surprise exam was possible. The paradox reveals how reasoning about one's own future knowledge can lead to contradictions and self-defeating conclusions. The unexpected exam illustrates broader puzzles about predicting prediction, knowing about knowledge, and the recursive problems that arise when epistemic agents try to model their own future epistemic states. These problems appear in economics, game theory, and artificial intelligence, wherever agents must reason about other agents who are reasoning about them. The paradox also demonstrates how logical reasoning can sometimes be self-undermining. The student's logic was valid, but led to conclusions that prevented him from responding appropriately to the actual situation. Sometimes the application of reason defeats the purposes that reason is supposed to serve. The thought experiments about paradox and self-reference work together to reveal both the power and the limitations of rational thought. They show how logical analysis can uncover hidden contradictions and illuminate the structure of complex concepts, while also revealing situations where formal logic seems inadequate to capture important features of reasoning and language. But the paradoxes also demonstrate something remarkable about human cognitive capacity. Despite encountering these fundamental limitations and contradictions, human minds continue to reason productively, to communicate effectively, to solve problems and make discoveries. The paradoxes might reveal not the failure of reasoning, but its resilience in the face of logical challenges. Perhaps the value of these thought experiments lies not in resolving the paradoxes they present, but in developing a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between formal logic and human reasoning. They suggest that perfect logical consistency might be less important than the capacity to reason flexibly and creatively, even when perfect consistency remains elusive. The experiments reveal thinking as a strange loop where consciousness examines itself, language refers to itself, and logic confronts its own foundations. In these recursive encounters, contradictions emerge that might seem to threaten the possibility of rational thought itself. Yet the very capacity to recognize and analyze these contradictions demonstrates the remarkable sophistication of the reasoning processes that generate them. You remain suspended in this strange loop, using thought to examine thought, employing language to analyze language, applying logic to understand the limits of logic itself. The paradoxes suggest that this reflexive capacity might be both the greatest achievement and the fundamental challenge of conscious reasoning, the source of both its power and its persistent puzzles. When you tilt your head just slightly, even the ordinary becomes unreal. The questions arrive disguised as the most familiar experiences, the simple act of choosing what to wear in the morning, the routine decision about which route to take to work, the automatic response when someone asks your name. These moments feel transparent, obvious, requiring no thought or analysis. Yet when examined closely, they reveal depths of complexity and strangeness that rival any philosophical puzzle you've encountered in more exotic territories. The ordinary world that seemed solid and comprehensible begins to shimmer when viewed from unexpected angles. The name you answer to daily becomes a curious collection of sounds that somehow refers to the flowing process you call yourself. The choices you make automatically reveal themselves as selections from infinite possibilities, constrained by forces you barely understand. The familiar transforms into the mysterious without changing at all. Perhaps this is where philosophy ultimately leads, not to abstract realms disconnected from daily life, but back to the immediate experience of being human, now seen with eyes trained to notice the extraordinary hiding within the ordinary. The thought experiments you've encountered haven't taken you away from your life but deeper into it, revealing layers of complexity and wonder that were always present but rarely acknowledged. Barry Schwartz observed that modern life presents an overwhelming array of choices that can paradoxically decrease rather than increase satisfaction and well-being. The paradox of choice reveals how too many options can create anxiety, regret, and decision paralysis rather than the freedom and fulfillment that choice is supposed to provide. When faced with dozens of breakfast cereals, hundreds of television channels, or thousands of potential romantic partners on dating apps, the cognitive burden of evaluation can become overwhelming. The time and energy required to assess all options can exceed the benefit gained from making slightly better choices. The possibility of having chosen differently can create persistent regret, even when choices work out well. The paradox appears throughout contemporary life. Career paths, consumer goods, lifestyle choices, entertainment options. The expansion of possibilities that was supposed to enhance human flourishing sometimes seems to complicate it instead. The paradox of choice reveals how cognitive limitations that evolved for simpler environments can become liabilities in environments of abundance. But the paradox also illustrates how context shapes the meaning of freedom. Choice feels liberating when options are scarce, and constraining when options are overwhelming. The same cognitive mechanisms that help you navigate limited possibilities can become counterproductive when possibilities multiply beyond your capacity to evaluate them effectively. Perhaps the paradox points toward the need for better choice architectures, ways of organizing options that preserve meaningful choice while reducing the cognitive burden of selection. Or perhaps it reveals the importance of developing personal strategies for managing choice, accepting satisfactory rather than optimal decisions, and recognizing when additional options don't improve outcomes. Jean Buridan described a perfectly rational donkey placed exactly between two identical piles of hay. Buridan's ass cannot decide which pile to approach, because both options are equally attractive, and the donkey has no basis for preferring one over the other. The donkey starves to death while deliberating, unable to act without a reason for action, but unable to find a reason that favours either choice. The thought experiment illustrates how perfect rationality can become self-defeating when choices are genuinely equivalent. Real decision-making often requires acting without complete justification, choosing when reasons are insufficient or absent, moving forward despite uncertainty about which option is best. Buridan's ass appears in many contemporary contexts: career choices between equally appealing options, investment decisions when expert advice conflicts, relationship choices when multiple people seem equally compatible. Perfect analysis can lead to paralysis when perfection is impossible and action is necessary. But the paradox also reveals the limits of purely rational approaches to decision-making. Perhaps good choices depend not just on logical analysis, but on intuition, values, and the capacity to act despite incomplete justification. Perhaps wisdom involves knowing when to stop deliberating and start living. The ass might also represent the need for arbitrary choice, in situations where deliberation cannot provide decisive reasons. Sometimes choosing randomly is better than not choosing at all. Sometimes the content of choice matters less than the capacity to choose and move forward. The tragedy of good intentions explores how well-meaning actions can produce harmful consequences despite genuine desires to help. Interventions designed to solve problems can create new problems, assistance can create dependency, protection can prevent growth, and solutions can generate unexpected complications that make original problems worse. The tragedy appears in many domains: foreign aid that undermines local economies, environmental regulations that produce unintended ecological consequences, educational reforms that disadvantage the students they're meant to help, medical interventions that create new health problems while solving old ones. Good intentions alone don't guarantee good outcomes, because complex systems respond to interventions in ways that can't always be predicted or controlled. The road to harmful consequences is often paved with genuine desires to improve situations, to help people, to solve important problems. But the tragedy of good intentions doesn't argue against trying to help or solve problems. Instead, it suggests the need for humility about the complexity of intervention, careful attention to unintended consequences, and willingness to modify approaches when outcomes don't match intentions. Perhaps the tragedy also points toward the importance of involving affected people in designing solutions rather than imposing well-intentioned interventions from outside. Those closest to problems often understand complexities and potential consequences that well-meaning outsiders might miss. The envelope problem presents two sealed envelopes, one containing twice as much money as the other. You're allowed to choose one envelope, open it, see how much money it contains, and then decide whether to switch to the other envelope. The puzzle asks whether you should switch, and the answer seems to depend on paradoxical reasoning about expected values. If your envelope contains X dollars, then the other envelope contains either 2X dollars or X divided by $2 with equal probability. The expected value of switching is 1.25X dollars, which exceeds X dollars, suggesting you should always switch. But this reasoning seems to apply regardless of which envelope you choose initially, creating the paradoxical conclusion that you should always switch to the other envelope. The envelope problem reveals how probabilistic reasoning can lead to contradictory conclusions when information is incomplete and symmetrical. The problem isn't with the mathematics, but with the assumptions about probability distributions and prior knowledge that the mathematical analysis requires. But the envelope problem also illustrates broader puzzles about decision-making under uncertainty. Real-life choices often involve incomplete information about alternatives, uncertain probabilities, and the need to act despite not knowing all relevant facts. The formal tools of decision theory provide guidance, but can't eliminate the fundamental challenges of choosing wisely when knowledge is limited. Perhaps the envelope problem points toward the importance of recognizing when formal analysis reaches its limits, and practical wisdom must take over. Sometimes the most sophisticated reasoning can't resolve uncertainty, and the capacity to act despite uncertainty becomes more important than to calculate optimal choices. The calendar swap asks what would happen if you could exchange your current life for a different life, by swapping places with yourself in an alternative timeline where you made different choices. Would you trade places with the version of yourself who chose a different career, moved to a different city, married a different person, or made any of the countless other choices that led to different outcomes? The swap reveals how difficult it is to evaluate your actual life compared to hypothetical alternatives. You know your current life intimately, its satisfactions and disappointments, its achievements and failures, its relationships and regrets. But you can only imagine alternative lives, filling in details with optimistic or pessimistic projections that might bear little resemblance to how those lives would actually unfold. The calendar swap also raises questions about personal identity and continuity across different life paths. Would the alternative version of yourself still be you in any meaningful sense? Or would different choices have created a different person who happens to share your name and origins? How much change would be required to make the alternative life belong to someone else, rather than another version of yourself? Perhaps the calendar swap illustrates the importance of accepting, rather than constantly second-guessing life choices. The alternative lives that seem more appealing might come with their own challenges and disappointments that aren't visible from your current perspective. The capacity to engage fully with actual life, rather than perpetually imagining better alternatives, might be more important than making theoretically optimal choices. The coin flip you never see examines a choice determined by chance. Heads, you move to New York, tails, you stay in your current city, but the result is never revealed to you. You must choose how to live without knowing which outcome the coin selected, creating a situation where your response to chance becomes more important than chance itself. The hidden coin flip reveals how much of life involves responding to uncertainty rather than responding to known outcomes. You make decisions based on incomplete information, pursue goals despite unpredictable obstacles, build relationships without guarantees about their future, and invest effort in projects whose success remains uncertain. But the coin flip also illustrates how attitude toward uncertainty can become more important than the uncertainty itself. Whether you approach unknown outcomes with anxiety or curiosity, with fear or excitement, with resignation or determination, affects your experience regardless of what the outcomes turn out to be. Perhaps the hidden coin flip points toward the importance of developing a constructive relationship with uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it. Life involves permanent uncertainty about outcomes, but it also provides opportunities to choose how to respond to that uncertainty in ways that shape experience regardless of what actually happens. The name you didn't choose explores the arbitrary assignment of identity markers that come to feel essential to who you are. Your name, chosen by others before you could participate in the decision, becomes so deeply associated with your sense of self that hearing it spoken creates automatic responses emotional reactions, and feelings of recognition that seem to emerge from the core of your identity. Yet the name is essentially arbitrary, a collection of sounds that could have been different without changing anything fundamental about who you are. If your parents had chosen differently, you would respond just as automatically to whatever sounds they selected, feeling the same sense of identity and recognition when that alternative name was spoken. The thought experiment reveals how much of identity depends on arbitrary assignments that become meaningful through repetition and social recognition. The name you didn't choose shapes how others relate to you, how you think about yourself, and how you present yourself to the world, despite being fundamentally contingent rather than essential. But the arbitrary name also illustrates how meaning can emerge from meaninglessness through social construction and personal investment. The sounds become meaningful because they're consistently associated with your particular existence, creating real significance from initially arbitrary assignments. Perhaps the name you didn't choose points toward the broader arbitrariness of identity categories, nationality, family background, cultural inheritance, that feel essential but could have been different under different circumstances. Recognizing this arbitrariness might create space for more conscious choices about which aspects of inherited identity to embrace and which to modify. The stranger at the door presents an unexpected visitor who claims to know you better than you know yourself, offering information about your unconscious motivations, hidden desires, and suppressed memories that you've never acknowledged. The stranger's knowledge seems accurate but unwelcome, revealing aspects of yourself that you would prefer to ignore or deny. The scenario raises questions about self-knowledge and self-deception, about the relationship between who you think you are and who you actually are, about whether ignorance about yourself might sometimes serve psychological functions that knowledge would disrupt. The stranger might represent psychoanalytic insight, feedback from others, scientific understanding of human psychology, or any other source of information about yourself that conflicts with your preferred self-image. The knowledge is unwelcome not because it's false, but because it's true in ways that complicate your sense of identity and autonomy. But the stranger also raises questions about whether complete self-knowledge is desirable or achievable. Perhaps some degree of self-deception is necessary for psychological well-being, motivation, and effective functioning. Perhaps the capacity to maintain useful illusions about yourself is as important as the capacity to see yourself clearly. The stranger at the door might illustrate the ongoing tension between self-awareness and self-acceptance, between the desire to understand yourself completely and the need to live with the complexity and contradictions that complete understanding might reveal. The meaning of meaning asks what makes anything meaningful rather than arbitrary, significant rather than trivial, worth caring about rather than dismissible. The question seems to apply to itself. Why does the search for meaning matter if meaning might be illusory or constructed rather than discovered? The recursive nature of the question reveals how meaning claims seem to require foundations that themselves require justification in ways that threaten infinite regress. Meaning needs meaning, significance needs significance, value needs value. Yet somewhere the chain of justification must stop or become circular if practical life is to be possible. Perhaps meaning doesn't require ultimate foundations, but emerges from the intersection of consciousness, care, and connection. Things become meaningful because conscious beings care about them, invest attention in them, build relationships around them, and create narratives that weave them into larger patterns of significance. But the meaning of meaning also reveals how philosophical questions can become self-undermining when pushed to their logical conclusions. The very act of caring enough to ask about meaning might demonstrate its reality even when rational analysis fails to provide satisfactory answers. Perhaps the question points toward meaning as something you participate in creating rather than something you discover or lose. The meaning of meaning might be found in the meaningful activities of seeking meaning, caring about meaning, and living as if meaning matters regardless of whether ultimate justification can be provided. The thought that thinks you reverses the normal assumption that you think thoughts, suggesting instead that thoughts might think you, that consciousness might be something that happens to you rather than something you control or direct. From this perspective, you don't have thoughts so much as thoughts have you. This reversal reveals how little control you actually exercise over what appears in consciousness. Thoughts arise without being summoned, memories surface without being called, emotions emerge without being chosen. The stream of consciousness flows according to patterns and associations that operate largely outside voluntary direction. The thought that thinks you might represent more accurate understanding of how consciousness actually works, compared to the illusion of mental control that everyday experience suggests. Perhaps the sense of being a unified self who thinks thoughts is itself a thought that arises in consciousness, rather than the foundation from which consciousness emerges. But the reversal also raises questions about responsibility, agency, and the possibility of self-direction. If thoughts think you rather than you thinking thoughts, what becomes of choice, effort, and the capacity to shape your own mental life through intention and practice? Perhaps the thought that thinks you points toward a more nuanced understanding of consciousness as neither completely controlled nor completely automatic, but rather as an ongoing interaction between awareness and the contents that arise within awareness, between the capacity to observe thoughts and the thoughts that appear for observation. The thought experiments about the everyday made strange work together to reveal how philosophical questioning can transform ordinary experience without changing anything external about that experience. They show how shifting perspective, asking unexpected questions, and examining familiar assumptions can make the most basic aspects of human life feel simultaneously mysterious and meaningful. But these final experiments also reveal how philosophical exploration eventually returns you to the practical reality of living a human life. The questions don't eliminate the need to choose, to act, to care about outcomes, to form relationships, and to create meaning in whatever circumstances you find yourself. Instead, they might help you engage with these practical necessities with greater awareness, humility, and appreciation for their complexity. The 100 thought experiments you've encountered tonight don't provide final answers to the questions they raise. They offer something perhaps more valuable: the experience of thinking deeply about fundamental questions, the recognition that ordinary experience contains extraordinary depths, and the awareness that consciousness itself is among the most remarkable phenomena in a universe that generally seems indifferent to questions of meaning and purpose. Some of these ideas may already be fading from memory, joining the vast collection of thoughts that have passed through your awareness and continued on their way. Others may return to you uninvited, days from now, in the middle of traffic, in a dream, in the quiet space between one thought and the next. They may surface when you're making a choice, watching your own mind work, wondering about the nature of time, or simply marveling at the fact that you're conscious at all in a universe where consciousness seems so rare and improbable. Don't try to answer them. Don't try to solve them. Don't try to file them away into neat categories that make them feel manageable and contained. Just carry them. Let them shift your shape, a little at a time, the way a river gradually changes its banks through the persistent pressure of water that knows no destination except the ongoing flow toward whatever comes next. The thought experiments have shown you edges where certainty gives way to mystery, boundaries where knowledge encounters its own limits, questions that deepen rather than resolve when examined closely. They've revealed consciousness as both the most intimate fact of your existence and the most puzzling phenomenon you'll ever encounter. You remain suspended between knowing and not knowing, between meaning and mystery, between the familiar and the strange. The thought experiments suggest that this suspension might not be a problem to solve, but a condition to inhabit. The human condition of being conscious enough to ask questions that consciousness cannot definitively answer, of caring about problems that reason cannot completely resolve, of finding significance in the ongoing search for understanding, even when perfect understanding remains elusive. In the end, you are both the question and the questioner, both the mystery and the one who marvels at mystery, both the consciousness that asks what consciousness is and the consciousness that will never fully answer. There is something both humbling and wonderful about this recursive situation, this strange loop where awareness examines itself and finds both clarity and confusion, both answers and deeper questions. The thought experiments fade, but the capacity for wonder remains. The specific puzzles dissolve, but the mysterious fact of being aware in an apparently unaware universe persists. The questions you've encountered tonight join the vast conversation that consciousness has been having with itself for as long as minds have been capable of asking what it means to be minded. And in that conversation, in that questioning, in that persistent human refusal to take consciousness for granted, or existence for granted, or the miracle of awareness for granted, something remarkable continues. The universe becoming conscious of itself, asking questions about its own nature, and finding both beauty and strangeness in whatever answers it discovers,